Hey guys, tonight we step into the sweltering darkness of 19th century America, where the summer heat didn't just make you uncomfortable, it could actually kill you. Picture yourself lying in a cramped bedroom, the air so thick and still that each breath feels like drinking warm soup. The walls radiate the day's absorbed heat back at you like a slow, cooking oven set to misery. Your nightclothes cling to your skin, already damp, and somewhere in the darkness, mosquitoes are holding a strategy meeting about which exposed patch of your flesh to target first. You probably wouldn't survive this, honestly, not without reaching for that thermostat on the wall, or that blessed air conditioning unit humming its mechanical lullaby. But here's the thing, none of that exists yet. You're stuck in a world where the most advanced cooling technology is opening a window and praying. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing that someone in Tokyo at 3 in the morning is drifting off to the same story as someone in Texas at midnight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1853, and you find yourself in Philadelphia during the third week of July. The sun has finally surrendered to the horizon about an hour ago, but you can still feel its presence lingering in everything around you. The brick facades of the row houses along your street have been absorbing sunlight since dawn, and now they're releasing that stored energy slowly, steadily, like bread ovens cooling after a long day of baking. You've been waiting for nightfall with desperate anticipation, hoping that darkness would bring relief. But here's a cruel lesson you're learning quickly. In 19th century America, night doesn't mean cool. Night just means dark and hot. You're standing at your bedroom window on the second floor, and you've pushed the wooden sash up as high as it will go. The opening is modest, maybe 18 inches wide, because windows in this era aren't designed for ventilation. They're designed to keep weather out and to limit the amount of expensive glass needed. The air outside is barely moving. What little breeze exists seems to have given up entirely, exhausted by its own efforts. You can hear your neighbours doing the same thing you're doing, shuffling around their homes, coughing, murmuring complaints, searching for any position that might feel slightly less suffocating than the last. Your thermometer, and yes, you're fortunate enough to own one, a small luxury mounted on your parlour wall, read 94 degrees at 6 o'clock this evening. Now, a few hours later, you estimate it's dropped to perhaps 88 or 89. Historians still argue whether the summers of the mid-19th century were actually hotter than today, or whether they simply felt worse because of how people lived. But what's certain is this. The experience of heat was profoundly different. There's no escape, there's no refuge, there's only endurance. You think about your grandmother back in the countryside and you remember her telling you stories about summer nights when she was young, how the family would drag their bedding to the barn and sleep in the hayloft where at least there was some cross-ventilation. But you live in a city now, part of the great American migration that's pulling people from farms into urban centres. Philadelphia's population has exploded in recent decades, and all these people are packed together in ways that trap and multiply heat. The density that makes the city economically vibrant also makes it thermally miserable. Here's something to consider. In rural America, summer nights could actually achieve a certain pleasantness once the sun went down. Open fields radiate their heat back into the atmosphere relatively quickly. Trees provide shade that prevents the ground from heating up as intensely in the first place. Farmhouses, often built with larger windows and designed with air circulation in mind, could catch whatever breezes wandered through. But in the city, you're surrounded by thermal mass. Brick, stone, cobblestone streets, all absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly through the night. Urban areas create what modern scientists would later call heat islands, places where temperatures run several degrees hotter than surrounding countryside. You're living in a heat island right now, though you have no name for it. You just know that your cousin's farm in Lancaster County seems impossibly cool in your imagination. The strangest part of all this is how normal it feels to everyone around you. This is simply what summer is. You don't rail against it any more than you'd rail against the existence of winter, or the fact that rivers flow downhill. Summer is hot. Summer nights are miserable. People have always sweated through July and August, and people always will. The idea that this fundamental reality might someday change, that a person could sleep in perfect comfort while the world outside broils, would strike you as pure fantasy, the fever dream of someone who's perhaps had too much sun. And yet, even within this acceptance, there's suffering. You can hear a baby crying somewhere down the street, that thin, exhausted wail of an infant who can't understand why they're so uncomfortable and can't do anything about it. You think about the ice house down on Market Street and wonder if there's any ice left, or if it's all melted by now. That precious frozen cargo from New England lakes reduced to lukewarm water in wooden boxes. Ice is a luxury anyway, something you might splurge on for a special occasion, not something ordinary people use just to cool down on a regular summer night. The very concept would seem absurdly extravagant. You finally give up on the window and move toward your bed. It sits in the corner of the room, a wooden frame supporting a mattress stuffed with feathers and horsehair. The mattress holds heat beautifully, which is wonderful in January and absolutely hellish right now. You've already stripped the wool blanket off and tossed it into the corner. The sheet beneath you is cotton, and it's better than nothing, but within minutes of lying down you know it will be damp with your sweat, clinging to your back in that particularly unpleasant way that makes you feel like you're slowly marinating. Your nightshirt is long, reaching below your knees, made of cotton that your wife laundered just yesterday. She's already in bed, lying very still on her side, trying not to move because movement generates heat, and heat is the enemy. You can hear her breathing, shallow and careful, and you know she's not asleep. Nobody's asleep yet. Sleep, on nights like this, comes in fits and starts, brief surrenders to exhaustion followed by waking up drenched and disoriented. You think about going downstairs to the cellar, where the temperature is noticeably cooler. Some families you know have started sleeping down there during the worst heat waves, spreading blankets on the dirt floor among the preserved vegetables and stored goods. But the cellar has its own problems. It's damp, it's dark in a way that feels oppressive rather than restful, and there's always the worry about rats or other creatures that might take offence at sharing their territory. Still, the thought tempts you. Anything seems better than this. Outside your window you hear the night sounds of Philadelphia beginning their familiar symphony, a dog barking somewhere, the distant rumble of a late wagon on cobblestones. Someone laughing. How anyone can laugh in this heat seems like a miracle. The city doesn't really sleep in summer, it just enters a lower gear, a kind of collective stupor where everyone moves slowly and speaks softly, and waits for autumn like prisoners awaiting parole. You close your eyes and try to imagine cool things. Mountain streams, spring rain, the first frost of October. It doesn't help much, but it gives your mind somewhere to go besides focusing on the heat pressing against you from every direction. Tomorrow will be another scorching day, and the day after that, and probably the entire week. The newspapers have been reporting on the heat wave. That's a relatively new phenomenon, this idea of treating weather as news. And they've mentioned deaths already, mostly infants and the elderly, mostly in the poorest neighbourhoods, where the housing is even more crowded and airless than yours. You wonder, in a drowsy half-thought, whether future generations will ever figure out how to defeat summer, whether someone will invent a machine that makes cold air the way a stove makes heat. It seems impossible, honestly. The idea that you could manufacture winter inside your house, that you could sleep in July as comfortably as you sleep in December, surely that's the stuff of fairy tales. And yet, you've seen so many impossible things in your lifetime already. The telegraph, the railroad, photographs that capture faces with perfect accuracy. Perhaps someday someone will find a way to capture cold too. But not tonight. Tonight you sweat. Tonight you endure. Tonight you join millions of other Americans in the great summer ritual of suffering through the darkness, waiting for dawn, and then immediately dreading the heat it will bring. You shift position again, searching for a cool spot on the sheet that doesn't exist, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimes 11 times. The night is young. The heat goes on. The heat you're experiencing isn't just uncomfortable, it's fundamentally different from anything a modern person would recognise as summer warmth. And that difference begins with understanding what's absent from your world, all the technologies and infrastructures that future generations will take entirely for granted. Start with the most obvious absence. There is no air conditioning. Not in your home, not in your workplace, not in any public building you might enter. The concept doesn't exist yet. Willis Carrier won't invent modern air conditioning until 1902, and even then it will take decades before the technology becomes affordable enough for ordinary homes. Right now, in the 1850s, the idea of mechanically cooling air is pure science fiction. The best anyone can imagine is perhaps waving a fan faster, or finding a cave to hide in. But the absence goes deeper than just missing technology. Consider how your home is constructed. Architects and builders of this era think about heat differently than their modern counterparts will. Their primary concern is surviving winter, not summer. In a world where heating your home requires constant effort, chopping wood, hauling coal, maintaining fires, keeping warmth inside is the paramount design goal. Houses are built to retain heat, which means they're built to make summer absolutely brutal. The walls of your Philadelphia row house are thick, probably 12 to 18 inches of solid brick. These walls are phenomenal insulators in winter, holding in the warmth from your fireplace and keeping out the bitter January winds. But in summer, those same walls become thermal batteries. They absorb heat all day long, every ray of sunlight that strikes them adding energy to the mass of brick and mortar. Then, once the sun sets, they slowly release that stored heat into your living space, hour after hour, through the entire night. You're essentially living inside a cooling bread oven. The windows, as you've already noticed, are small, glass is expensive, and large windows mean large heating bills in winter. So your house has modest openings that don't allow much air movement even when they're fully open. And here's a quirky detail that will seem insane to future generations. Many windows in this era don't even have screens. The fine mesh that keeps insects out while letting air flow through hasn't become standard yet. So you face a horrible choice on summer nights. Open the window and let in mosquitoes, flies and moths, or keep it closed and suffocate. Either way, you lose. Cross-ventilation, that architectural principle where you place windows opposite each other to create airflow through a building, is understood in theory but rarely implemented in urban housing. Row houses share walls with their neighbours on both sides, which means you can only have windows on the front and back of your building. If you're lucky, opening both might create some draft. If you're unlucky, if the wind is still, if your neighbour's buildings block the air, you get nothing. The air in your bedroom sits there, heavy and unmoving, like an unwelcome guest who refuses to leave. Now consider the geography of where Americans have chosen to build their cities, and you'll understand why certain regions suffer more than others. The eastern seaboard, where most of the population is concentrated, combines the worst elements for summer comfort: humidity from the Atlantic Ocean, minimal elevation, and that dense urban construction we've already discussed. Cities like Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore and Boston become steam baths every July. But if you think the north is bad, let your mind wander southward. The American South experiences summer as a months-long siege. Places like Charleston, New Orleans and Savannah contend with temperatures that regularly climb past 100 degrees, combined with humidity levels that make the air feel like warm soup. These cities were largely built by people from temperate European climates who had no cultural experience with such conditions. They adapted as best they could. High ceilings, wide porches, houses raised on stilts to catch breezes, but summer remained brutal. Historians still argue whether Southern culture's famous slow pace, an emphasis on leisure, developed partly as a heat adaptation strategy. When it's 95 degrees with 90% humidity, moving quickly isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. The afternoon siesta, the long meals, the general reluctance to hurry anything, these might be survival mechanisms as much as cultural preferences. The Mississippi River Valley presents its own special hell. Cities like St. Louis and Memphis sit in a bowl of humidity, surrounded by waterways that pump moisture into the air constantly. The confluence of rivers creates a microclimate that traps heat and moisture like nowhere else on the continent. Summers there have a physical weight to them, a presence that presses against your skin and makes every movement feel like wading through warm syrup. Out west, things are different, but not necessarily better. The deserts of the southwest, which are just beginning to attract American settlers in significant numbers, offer dry heat instead of humid heat. In some ways, this is more tolerable. Sweat actually evaporates and cools you down, unlike in the humid east where sweat just accumulates on your skin without providing much relief. But desert heat comes with its own problems: extreme temperatures that can exceed 115 degrees, the complete absence of shade in many areas, and the constant danger of dehydration. You think about the people pushing westward right now, the California gold rush migrants and the pioneers on the Oregon Trail. Many of them are crossing the Great Plains and the deserts in summer, dragging wagons through sand and scrubland under a sun that seems personally malevolent. The death toll from heat and dehydration on those trails is staggering, though it's often overshadowed in history books by more dramatic dangers like disease and conflict. But plenty of people simply collapse from heat stroke in the middle of nowhere, their bodies too depleted to continue. Back in your Philadelphia bedroom, you're grateful at least for the Atlantic's moderating influence. Cities on the coast tend to run a few degrees cooler than at inland areas, and occasional sea breezes provide blessed relief. But a few degrees cooler still means brutally hot by any reasonable standard, and those sea breezes are famously unreliable. One thing that makes this era's heat particularly insufferable is the complete lack of refrigeration in daily life. Your food is warm, your drinks are warm, the water in your basin is warm. The pitcher of water by your bed, which you've been sipping from all evening, has reached the same temperature as your room, probably close to 90 degrees. Drinking it provides hydration but no refreshment. You'd kill for something actually cold right now. And you mean that with more sincerity than you'd normally apply to such expressions. The ice trade exists, yes, but it's a luxury industry serving wealthy households, fancy hotels, and businesses that can afford it. Ice is harvested from New England lakes in winter, stored in insulated ice houses packed with sawdust, and then shipped by train and wagon to cities throughout the country. By the time it reaches your neighbourhood in July, it's expensive, a true indulgence. You might buy a small block for a special occasion, watch it melt over a few hours, and briefly experience the miraculous sensation of a cold drink. But it's not something you can sustain night after night. The wealthy, of course, have options you don't. Rich families install iceboxes in their homes, wooden cabinets lined with zinc or tin, with a compartment on top for ice blocks that slowly cool the food stored below. They have servants who can fan them through the hottest hours, creating artificial breezes on demand. Their houses are often larger, with higher ceilings and better ventilation. Some have summer homes in the mountains or by the shore, places they retreat to when the city becomes unbearable. But you're not wealthy. You're part of the great American middle, a skilled worker, a clerk, a small shopkeeper, someone with enough resources to live comfortably but not enough to escape the fundamental conditions of your era. And that means you sweat through summer just like your neighbours, just like the working poor in the tenements nearby, just like almost everyone except the fortunate few at the very top. There's a strange democracy to 19th century heat, at least compared to modern times. Today, air conditioning has created a world where the wealthy can live in perpetual spring, while the poor still suffer through summer. But in your era, even the richest man in Philadelphia can't make his bedroom truly cool on a July night. He can make it slightly less horrible, with ice, with fans, with better architecture, but he can't escape the fundamental reality of summer heat. In some small way, this shared suffering creates a bond across class lines. Everyone understands what summer nights feel like. Everyone has stories about sleepless weeks in August. The heat is a universal American experience in ways that will later fade as technology creates new divisions. You hear a train whistle in the distance, the sound of a locomotive pulling into one of the stations that ring the city. Trains are one of the marvels of your age, symbols of progress and connection, but they're also absolutely miserable in summer. Passenger cars have no cooling whatsoever, just open windows that let in cinders and soot, along with whatever air might be moving. The cars themselves are wooden boxes that bake in the sun, and the steam engine at the front adds its own heat to the atmosphere. A summer train journey is an exercise in endurance. Hours of sitting in a rolling oven, arriving at your destination exhausted and drenched. You turn over on your mattress again, feeling the damp sheet beneath you shift and cling. The night feels endless, the heat feels eternal, and you're only about a third of the way through until dawn. Now that you understand the world you're living in, this sweltering, unventilated, pre-air conditioning reality, let's look more closely at the space where you're actually trying to sleep. Your bedroom isn't just uncomfortable by circumstance, it's practically designed to maximize your misery, though no one intended it that way. You're in a room that measures roughly 12 feet by 14 feet, which is actually considered a decent-sized bedroom for an urban household in this era. The ceiling sits about 9 feet above the floor, standard for row house construction. In winter, you appreciate this relatively modest ceiling height because heat rises and you want to keep the warm air within reach. But in summer, that same ceiling feels oppressively close. The hottest air in the room has nowhere to go, so it just pulls above you, radiating downward. The walls are plastered and painted, which is nicer than bare brick, but doesn't help with temperature. Plaster holds heat beautifully, and the paint, probably a lead-based whitewash that nobody yet realizes is slowly poisoning everyone, doesn't do anything to reflect or dissipate thermal energy. The walls feel warm to the touch even now. hours after sunset. If you press your palm against the exterior wall, the one facing the street, you can almost feel the day's sun still stored in the brick behind the plaster. Let's talk about that window situation again, because it really is central to your suffering. Your bedroom has one window, facing the narrow alley between your building and the one next door. This is actually considered good fortune. Interior bedrooms in many row houses have no windows at all, just a door that opens to a hallway. Those rooms are coffin-like spaces where air essentially never moves, where summer nights feel like slow suffocation. Your window measures perhaps 2 feet wide by 3 feet tall. It's a double-hung sash window, meaning the bottom half can be raised while the top remains closed. In theory, you could open both halves to create some vertical airflow, but in practice, the top sash has been painted shut for as long as you've lived here, and you've never bothered to fix it. So you get whatever air wants to enter through the bottom opening, which tonight is essentially none. The glass in your window is uneven, with slight ripples and bubbles that distort your view of the alley outside. This is typical of period glass manufacturing, where perfect flatness is expensive and reserved for shops and wealthy homes. The imperfect glass doesn't affect airflow, but it adds to the slightly warped, dreamlike quality of summer nights, where everything already feels distorted by heat and exhaustion. Speaking of distortion, let's examine the bed itself, that centerpiece of your nocturnal torment. It's a wooden bedstead, probably walnut or cherry, with tall posts at each corner and slats running across to support the mattress. The wood is beautiful, carved with modest decorative flourishes, polished to a warm glow, but wood retains heat just like everything else in this room. The frame itself contributes to the thermal load you're experiencing. The mattress resting on those slats is where the real trouble lies. It's a tick mattress, which means it's essentially a large fabric bag stuffed with filling material. Yours is filled with a combination of feathers and horsehair, which was considered quite comfortable when you purchased it. The feathers provide cushioning, while the horsehair adds structure and resilience. In winter, this mattress is wonderfully insulating, holding your body heat close and keeping you warm through freezing nights. But here's the thing about feathers and horsehair. They don't breathe. They trap heat and moisture against your body with remarkable efficiency. Lying on your mattress right now feels like lying on a warm, slightly damp cloud that refuses to let any air reach your back. The filling has compressed over years of use, creating spots where it bunches and areas where it's worn thin, but nowhere has it developed anything like the ventilation you're desperately craving. Some households use straw-stuffed mattresses instead of feather ticks, especially among the less wealthy. Straw is cheaper and arguably breathes slightly better, but it comes with its own problems. It crinkles loudly with every movement, it breaks down into dust and fragments, and it harbours insects with alarming hospitality. Bedbugs love straw mattresses like nothing else, and dealing with an infestation means dragging the entire tick outside, burning the straw, and restuffing from scratch. At least your feather mattress doesn't rustle every time you shift position. Underneath the mattress, between it and the wooden slats, you might have a straw pallet for additional cushioning. And beneath all of that, some beds feature rope supports instead of wooden slats. A crisscross pattern of thick rope that provides some give and supposedly allows more air circulation. The phrase "sleep tight" may derive from this practice, referring to the need to periodically tighten the ropes as they stretched with use. Historians still argue whether this etymology is accurate or a folk invention, but the ropes themselves were definitely real, and they did require regular maintenance. Now let's look at what's covering you, or rather what you've desperately thrown off the bed. Your normal bedding includes a bottom sheet, a top sheet, and at least one blanket, with additional quilts available for winter. The bottom sheet is cotton, which is about the best material available for hot weather. Cotton breathes relatively well compared to linen or wool, and it feels smooth against skin, but even cotton, once it's absorbed your sweat, becomes a clammy prison. The top sheet is also cotton, and you've kicked it to the foot of the bed where it lies in a tangled heap. The blanket, woven wool, heavy and warm, was the first thing to go. It's currently sitting in the corner of the room, banished until October. Wool blankets are absolutely essential for winter survival, but their presence on a summer night would be actual torture. Yet here's a funny thing. Some people in this era still use at least a light covering even in extreme heat, partly from modesty and partly from a genuine belief that night air is dangerous and should be kept off the body. You've heard this theory, that miasmas and unhealthy vapours prowl through darkness. But you're too hot to care about invisible threats right now. What are you actually wearing as you lie here sweating? Your nightshirt, almost certainly. Men's sleepwear in this era consists primarily of the nightshirt, a long garment resembling an oversized shirt that reaches somewhere between the knee and the ankle. It's typically made of cotton or linen, and it's loose enough to allow some air movement around your body. The idea of sleeping in less, in modern-style shorts or underwear, or heaven forbid nothing at all, is complicated by social norms, religious beliefs, and the simple fact that you share a bed with your wife. Your wife's nightgown is similar in concept, but even longer and more voluminous. Women's sleepwear of this era is designed for modesty above all else, with high necklines, long sleeves, and hemlines that reach the floor. Even in private, even in the marital bed, expectations about female coverage remain intense. Your wife has probably pushed her sleeves up and loosened whatever buttons or ties secure her nightgown's collar, but she's still wrapped in considerably more fabric than her body temperature would prefer. Here's a quirky detail about 19th century sleep habits. Many people wear nightcaps to bed. These are soft caps, usually cotton or linen, that cover the head and keep hair contained. The practice makes some sense in winter, when a drafty house can give you a head cold, and for women, nightcaps help preserve elaborate hairstyles. But in summer, adding any layer to your body, even a thin cap, seems like madness. Yet the habit persists for some, a triumph of custom over comfort. You've taken your nightcap off, obviously. It's sitting on the small table beside your bed, next to the candle you extinguished an hour ago, and the pitcher of water that's now room temperature. That table also holds your pocket watch, wound, and ready to tell you exactly how many hours of suffering remain until dawn. You've learned not to check it too frequently, because knowing it's only midnight when it feels like you've been lying here forever just makes everything worse. The floor beneath your bed is wooden, planks of pine that have been sanded and perhaps stained. In some homes, you'd find a rug beside the bed, something to keep feet warm when they touch down on cold winter mornings, but you've rolled up the rug and stored it away for the season. Any additional fabric in this room feels like an insult right now. Look at the other furniture in your bedroom. A wardrobe for clothes, a washstand with basin and pitcher, a chair, perhaps a small dresser with mirror. Each piece is solid wood, each one holding and radiating heat. The wardrobe is particularly impressive in its thermal storage capacity. A large wooden cabinet full of more fabric, all of it contributing to the room's stuffiness. You've left the wardrobe doors slightly open in the hope that it might help somehow, though you're not sure why. The ceiling above you is plain, white-painted plaster like the walls. No fan hangs there. Ceiling fans exist in this era, but they're hand-operated, requiring someone to pull a cord to make the blades move. They're found in fancy hotels and wealthy homes, not in middle-class row houses. Besides, even if you had one, you'd need to wake up every time you wanted a breeze and pull the cord yourself, which defeats the purpose of trying to sleep. So here you are, in this box of warm wood and plaster, lying on your cloud of feathers and horsehair, wearing your cotton shroud, waiting for morning or unconsciousness, whichever comes first. You've already shifted positions 6 times in the last 10 minutes, but let's talk more about what you're wearing and why simply stripping down isn't the obvious solution it might seem to a modern person. Clothing in the 19th century isn't just practical covering. It's moral statement, social signal, and often, surprisingly, genuine protection against the very elements you're trying to escape. First, let's acknowledge the obvious. You're wearing more to bed than any modern person would consider reasonable in this heat. Your nightshirt, even if it's the lightest cotton available, adds a layer between your skin and whatever feeble air movement might exist. Logic would suggest removing it entirely and sleeping nude, letting your body's sweat evaporate freely and take heat with it. But logic isn't the only force governing behaviour in 1850s America. Sleeping naked is considered deeply improper for several overlapping reasons. Religious teaching emphasises bodily modesty as a virtue, and many devout Christians believe that the human form should be covered except for specific necessary purposes. The body, in this view, is a source of temptation and sin, and even in the privacy of the marital bedroom, unnecessary exposure flirts with spiritual danger. You might find these ideas more or less compelling personally, but they're woven into the fabric of your culture, and defying them feels transgressive even when no one's watching. Beyond religious considerations, there's a practical medical belief that was widely held in this era. The idea that night air is inherently dangerous, and that the body needs protection from it. This isn't quite the same as the older miasma theory, though it's related. Many people genuinely believe that sleeping uncovered exposes you to unhealthy influences that can cause illness. A chill in the night, even a warm night, might penetrate an unclothed body and cause fever, rheumatism, or any number of ailments. Better to sweat beneath your nightshirt than risk whatever mysterious forces prowl through darkness. Historians still argue whether this fear of night air had any rational basis or was entirely superstitious. There's a kernel of truth buried in it. In an era before germ theory was widely accepted, people noticed that certain diseases seemed to correlate with night exposure, particularly in swampy or low-lying areas. We now know that mosquitoes, which are most active at night, were spreading malaria and other diseases. People didn't understand the mechanism, but they observed the pattern and developed protective habits accordingly. Wearing covering at night might have offered some protection against mosquito bites, though nightshirts certainly weren't as effective as modern insect repellent. There's also the matter of shared sleeping spaces to consider. You share your bed with your wife, as most married couples do. Children often share beds with siblings, and in poorer households, entire families might sleep in a single room or even a single bed. In these circumstances, nudity becomes socially complicated even among family members. The nightshirt provides a minimum layer of privacy and propriety, a way of being intimate without being exposed. Let's look more closely at what nightshirts and nightgowns of this era actually look like and feel like. Men's nightshirts are typically made from cotton, linen, or in some cases a light wool blend for winter. The cotton versions, which are what you'd choose for summer, come in various thread counts and weaves. Better quality means softer fabric and slightly better breathability, but even the finest cotton still holds body heat more than bare skin would. The cut of a nightshirt is loose, designed for comfort rather than fashion. It resembles an oversized dress shirt, with a collar that buttons at the neck, long sleeves, and a body that hangs straight from the shoulders to below the knee. Some men prefer their nightshirts longer, reaching almost to the ankle, while others choose shorter versions that offer more freedom of movement. Either way, you're wrapped in a considerable amount of fabric. Colours are typically white or off-white because white cotton is the cheapest and most readily available. Bleaching technology is improving throughout this century, making white fabric more affordable, and white also has the advantage of showing dirt, which encourages regular laundering. Some nightshirts feature simple decorations, a bit of embroidery at the collar, a contrasting ribbon trim, but most are plain and utilitarian. Women's nightgowns are substantially more elaborate, reflecting the era's higher standards for female modesty and decorative dress. A typical nightgown has a high neckline, often with a ruffle or lace trim that extends up under the chin. Sleeves are long and full, gathered at the wrist with a cuff or elastic band. The body of the gown is loose and flowing, reaching all the way to the floor, with additional fabric gathered at the waist for a feminine silhouette. Your wife's nightgown probably has buttons or a ribbon closure running partway down the front, allowing her to get the garment on and off while preserving modesty as much as possible. The fabric is likely cotton, though wealthier women might choose fine linen or even silk for summer. Decorative elements abound. Lace trim at the neckline and cuffs, pin tucks creating decorative patterns in the fabric, perhaps embroidered flowers or monograms. All of this decoration adds weight and reduces breathability. The more elaborate the nightgown, the more fabric a woman is wrapped in, and the hotter she becomes. Yet fashion dictates these elaborations, and the social expectation is that a woman should look presentable even in bed, even in private, even when she's sweating through another miserable July night. Here's a quirky detail. Some people sleep in their regular underwear rather than dedicated nightclothes. Men's underwear in this era consist of a union suit, a one-piece garment covering the torso and legs, with buttons down the front or separate undershirt and drawers. Sleeping in your union suit is somewhat common, especially among working-class men who might not own a separate nightshirt. It's slightly less formal, but provides similar coverage. Women's underwear is even more extensive. A respectable woman of this era wears multiple layers beneath her daytime dress. A chemise, a loose short-sleeved garment worn directly against the skin. Drawers, loose, knee-length undergarments split at the crotch for practicality. A corset or stays, though not usually worn to bed, and various petticoats. Sleeping in just a chemise would be somewhat less formal than a proper nightgown, but would provide similar modest coverage. The fabrics available for all these garments are limited compared to modern options. Cotton is the summer standard. It breathes better than wool, it's more comfortable against skin than linen, and it's increasingly affordable as American cotton production expands. But cotton cultivation is deeply entangled with slavery in this era, a connection that some people are aware of and others prefer not to think about too closely. Every cotton nightshirt has a complicated moral history woven into its threads. Linen is an older fabric, still used but declining in popularity for everyday clothing. It has advantages in hot weather. It absorbs moisture well and has a cool hand. But it wrinkles terribly and doesn't hold up as well to repeated washing. Wealthy households might still prefer fine linen bedding and nightclothes, but the middle and working classes have largely switched to cotton. And wool, of course, is out of the question for summer sleepwear, though some people still wear light wool undershirts year-round, believing they help regulate body temperature. This belief has some scientific merit. Wool can absorb moisture without feeling wet, and its fibres naturally resist odour. But the thought of wool against your skin right now makes you shudder. Let's consider what people do when the nightshirt becomes unbearable. Some men, in the privacy of their own homes, do remove their nightshirts and sleep in just their drawers or even naked. This is more common than polite society would admit, but it's done discreetly and rarely discussed. A man wouldn't mention to his colleagues that he slept nude last night, any more than he'd discuss other intimate details of his bedroom life. Women have fewer options for reducing coverage without crossing into immodesty. A woman might push her sleeves up, unbutton her collar, hike up her nightgown to free her legs, small adjustments that help a little while maintaining basic coverage. Very bold women might remove their nightgowns entirely in private, but this would be considered quite shocking if discovered and could damage a woman's reputation. Children, at least, are given some dispensation. Babies and toddlers might sleep in just a diaper or clout, their vulnerability to heat recognised even in an era of strict propriety. Older children often wear shorter, simpler nightshirts or nightgowns than adults, and parents might overlook a child kicking off covers and pulling up their hem in the night. You turn over again, your nightshirt twisting around your body in a way that's simultaneously too tight and too loose. You consider, for perhaps the 100th time this summer, just taking the damn thing off, but your wife is right there, and your bedroom door doesn't lock, and the children might come in if they wake with nightmares, and somehow it just seems easier to suffer. The fabric clings to your back where sweat has accumulated. Tomorrow you'll change into a fresh nightshirt, and your wife will add this damp one to the laundry pile, and the cycle will repeat. Night after night, all summer long the same clammy routine. The clock in the hallway downstairs chimes midnight, 12 slow notes that seem to stretch forever in the still, heavy air. You're now officially into tomorrow, though it feels like today has been going on for approximately 1,000 years. Let's take a closer look at this bedroom of yours, because the space itself is conspiring against any hope of rest. Your mattress, as we've discussed, is essentially a fabric bag full of insulating material that traps heat against your body with impressive efficiency. But there's more to this torture device than its filling. Consider its size and how you're sharing it. You're sleeping in what would be called a full-size or double bed, measuring approximately 54 inches wide by 75 inches long. This is the standard bed size for married couples of your era. Kings and queens as bed dimensions don't exist yet, and twin beds for married couples won't become a trend until the early 20th century. You and your wife share these 54 inches of width, which means each of you gets about 27 inches of personal space. 27 inches, not quite 2.5 feet. Every time one of you shifts position, the other feels it. Every radiated body heat from your wife's form drifts across the narrow gap between you. You're essentially two human furnaces placed side by side in a poorly ventilated oven, each contributing to the other's misery. Some couples try to solve this problem by sleeping at opposite edges of the mattress, creating maximum distance between their heat-generating bodies. You've attempted this tonight, hugging your side of the bed while your wife does the same on hers. But the mattress has developed sags and valleys over years of use, and you both tend to roll toward the middle where the depression is deepest. You meet in the centre like two hot, sweaty magnets, mutually repelled and mutually attracted by gravity and the topography of worn bedding. Here's a detail that might horrify modern sensibilities. Mattresses of this era aren't cleaned with anything approaching regularity. You can't exactly throw a tick mattress in the washing machine. It's too large, too heavy when wet, and the filling would be ruined by immersion. So mattresses accumulate sweat, skin cells, dust, and other biological residues over years of nightly use. The smell of an old mattress in summer, when heat activates all those trapped organic compounds, is something you've simply learned to ignore. It's the smell of sleep, of home, of every bedroom you've ever known. Periodically, perhaps once a year if you're diligent, you might drag the mattress outside on a sunny day to air out. The sunlight kills some of the organisms living in it, and the fresh air carries away some of the accumulated odours. Some households sprinkle the mattress with baking soda before airing it, hoping to absorb smells. But these measures provide temporary improvement at best. Within a few weeks, the mattress has returned to its normal state of gradual biological accumulation. The bed frame beneath your mattress contributes to airflow problems in its own way. Remember, the mattress sits on wooden slats or rope supports, with perhaps a straw pallet underneath for cushioning. All of this creates a layered structure that doesn't breathe well. Air can't circulate beneath the mattress or through it. You're lying on a platform of trapped warmth. Some beds of this era feature canopies and curtains, 4 tall posts supporting a fabric frame with heavy drapes that can be drawn closed around the sleeping space. Canopy beds are traditional, dating back centuries, and they originally served practical purposes. The curtains kept drafts out in winter and provided some protection against insects and falling debris in homes with thatched or rough-hewn ceilings. But a canopy bed in summer is an instrument of torture. Drawing those curtains creates a tiny, airless chamber where heat and humidity concentrate to suffocating levels. You don't have a canopy bed, thankfully. Your bedstead is the simpler 4-post design, tall posts at each corner but no overhead structure or curtains. The posts are decorative at this point, a vestige of earlier furniture styles, but at least they're not actively making things worse. You can look up from your pillow and see the ceiling directly, not a fabric enclosure that would trap your exhaled breath and body heat in an ever-warming cloud. Your pillow is another source of misery worth examining. It's filled with feathers like your mattress, and it's wearing a cotton case that's now damp with your head sweat. The pillow has a particular way of heating up exactly where your head rests, creating a warm spot that you try to escape by turning the pillow over. This works for approximately 30 seconds, until the fresh side also heats up, and you're back where you started. The pillow flipping ritual is a nightly occurrence in summer, a hopeless but compulsive behaviour that everyone performs and nobody talks about. Let's look at the room's contents beyond the bed. Against one wall stands your wardrobe, a large wooden cabinet where you and your wife store your clothing. The wardrobe is closed, its doors shut against dust and moths, but the clothes inside are adding to the room's thermal mass. Wool suits, cotton dresses, linen undergarments, all of it hanging in the dark, holding heat, contributing its small share to the overall stuffiness. The washstand in the corner holds a ceramic basin and pitcher. The pitcher contains water for washing, and in theory, you could dip a cloth in it and cool your face. But the water is room temperature now, offering no relief. Some people put their water pitcher in the cellar overnight to keep it slightly cooler, then bring it up for morning washing. You've done this occasionally, but the improvement is modest, and the effort of carrying water up and down stairs doesn't seem worth it most nights. A small mirror hangs above the washstand, its surface slightly clouded with age. You avoid looking in it on nights like this. You know what you'd see. A flushed face, hair matted with sweat, eyes tired and vaguely resentful. The reflection of a person who should be sleeping but isn't, who wants to be comfortable but can't be, who's trapped in this hot box until morning, brings its own brand of fresh misery. Your wife stirs beside you, shifting position with a small sound of frustration. She's been lying still for a while, probably hoping that motionlessness would somehow summon sleep, but it hasn't worked. You hear her push her hair off her neck. Women's long hair, kept pinned up during the day, often comes down at night, and in summer it becomes a warm scarf wrapped around the throat and shoulders. "Can't sleep either," she murmurs, not really expecting an answer. "Too hot," you respond, stating the obvious. There's a small silence. You've had this conversation before, hundreds of times over summer nights, and it never leads anywhere useful. Commiserating about the heat doesn't make the heat go away. But there's comfort in shared suffering, in knowing you're not alone in your misery. Your wife sits up and you hear her reaching for the water pitcher on the nightstand on her side. She pours herself a small amount, drinks it, and sets the cup back down. The water won't help her sleep, but at least it will keep her hydrated through the night's sweating. You should drink more water too, you know. The body loses tremendous amounts of fluid through perspiration on nights like this, and people do sometimes suffer from dehydration, even without leaving their beds. But drinking means eventually needing to relieve yourself, which means getting up and navigating to the chamber pot in the corner, or, worse, making your way downstairs to the outhouse in the yard. Neither option appeals when you're already lying down, when any movement generates more heat and more discomfort. Historians still argue whether 19th century people drank enough water in general. The beverage landscape was different. Milk was often contaminated and dangerous. Water supplies were frequently polluted with sewage and industrial runoff, and alcoholic drinks like beer and cider were sometimes safer than the local water. People drank, but they didn't necessarily drink the right things, and they often didn't drink enough. Chronic mild dehydration may have been common, which would make summer nights even more dangerous than they already were. The room feels close, like the walls are pressing inward. It's an illusion, a trick of exhausted perception, but it feels absolutely real. The air is thick, almost tactile, and every breath seems to require effort. You find yourself taking shallow breaths, as if deep ones would draw too much of that thick, warm air into your lungs. You close your eyes and try again to will yourself towards sleep. Tomorrow will be another scorching day, and you need rest to face it. But rest won't come on command, not when your body is this uncomfortable, not when the room is this stifling. The church bell tolls once, marking midnight, and the sound seems to hang in the air longer than usual, reluctant to dissipate in the heavy atmosphere. Let's step outside your personal suffering for a moment and compare it to what others are experiencing across America tonight. Because as bad as you have it in your Philadelphia row house, things could be considerably worse, or in some cases marginally better. Start with the cities, those dense concentrations of humanity and brick and ambition that define urban America in this era. New York City, 100 miles to your northeast, is experiencing the same heat wave you are, but with special characteristics that make it perhaps the worst place on the continent to be right now. Manhattan is an island, which you might think would help. Water surrounds it, breezes should flow freely. But Manhattan's geography conspires against its residents in summer. The island is long and narrow, with most of its width consisting of densely packed buildings that block whatever air movement might occur. The East River and Hudson River lie tantalizingly close to almost every point on the island, but their cooling influence barely penetrates the canyon-like streets. And those streets are filled with people, far more people per square mile than almost anywhere else in America. The Five Points neighborhood, the Lower East Side, the tenement districts that house immigrant workers. These areas pack dozens of families into buildings designed for a handful. Entire families live in single rooms, sometimes sharing beds in shifts, and the combined body heat of all these people raises indoor temperatures above even the brutal outdoor levels. Imagine a tenement room on a night like this, perhaps 12 feet by 12 feet, with one small window facing an airshaft so narrow that sunlight never reaches the bottom. 6 people share this space, parents and 4 children, or perhaps 2 families doubling up to afford the rent. The single bed is occupied by whoever needs it most. Others sleep on the floor, on chairs, wherever they can find horizontal space. The room has absorbed heat from the surrounding apartments all day, and it releases that heat now into an atmosphere already thick with human exhalation and perspiration. The smell in such a room is something you'd rather not imagine too vividly. 6 bodies sweating continuously, chamber pots not always emptied promptly, food stored without refrigeration, clothes that can't be washed as often as they should be. The odours layer upon each other until they become a physical presence, a miasma that coats the inside of the nose and throat. People living in these conditions develop a remarkable tolerance, their senses numbing to what would overwhelm someone coming in fresh from the outside. Mortality rates in New York's tenement districts spike dramatically during summer heat waves. Infants die in heartbreaking numbers, their small bodies unable to regulate temperature effectively. The elderly succumb to heat exhaustion and dehydration. Even healthy working-age adults sometimes simply stop breathing in the night, their overtaxed systems giving out in the hours before dawn. Newspapers in this era have begun reporting on these deaths, tallying the heatwave casualties like battle statistics, and the numbers are genuinely shocking. Now shift your imagination southward, to the cities of the former Confederacy still recovering from war. Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, these places combine northern-level urban density with southern heat and humidity. The results are predictably terrible. New Orleans holds a special place in the hierarchy of American summer suffering. The city sits in a bowl surrounded by water, the Mississippi River, Lake Pontchartrain, countless swamps and bayous, and this water pumps humidity into the air relentlessly. Summer nights in New Orleans don't cool down because the moisture holds the day's heat long after sunset. Temperatures that would be bearable in dry air become oppressive when the humidity exceeds 90%. And then there are the mosquitoes. New Orleans is mosquito paradise, with standing water everywhere providing breeding grounds, and warm, moist conditions allowing the insects to thrive. Yellow fever, carried by these mosquitoes, has ravaged the city repeatedly throughout the 19th century. Summer in New Orleans means not just heat exhaustion, but the very real possibility of contracting a disease that kills roughly half its victims. Wealthy residents flee if they can, leaving for the north or the mountains until frost makes the city safe again. The poor, as always, stay and take their chances. But let's also consider the other side of the spectrum, the places where summer nights are actually tolerable, even pleasant. They exist in 19th century America, though they're not where most people live. The mountains offer refuge to those who can reach them. The Catskills, the Adirondacks, the White Mountains of New Hampshire, the Blue Ridge Ranges of Virginia, all these elevated regions see summer temperatures 10 to 20 degrees cooler than the lowland cities. A night at 2,000 feet elevation might drop into the 60s, cool enough for comfortable sleep, cool enough to actually need that blanket you've banished from your Philadelphia bedroom. Mountain resorts are becoming big business in this era, catering to wealthy families seeking escape from summer heat. The Catskill Mountain House in New York, the Mount Washington Hotel in New Hampshire, grand establishments with broad verandas and cool breezes, and wealthy guests who can afford to spend entire summers in comfort. These resorts represent a new kind of American leisure, available only to the fortunate few, but pointing toward a future where climate control, whether through geographic escape or technological invention, becomes expected rather than exceptional. Seashore towns also offer summer relief, at least in theory. Ocean breezes can make coastal areas considerably more comfortable than inland locations. Cape May in New Jersey, Newport in Rhode Island, the beaches of the Massachusetts coast. These destinations attract summer visitors seeking the cooling influence of sea air. But the shore comes with its own complications. Mosquitoes can be worse near marshes and inlets. Humidity remains high, and the accommodations range from luxurious hotels to cramped boarding houses, where you might find yourself no more comfortable than you were in the city. Historians still argue whether the 19th century summer resort phenomenon was primarily about health, comfort, social display, or some combination of all three. Doctors of the era prescribed seaside and mountain retreats for various ailments, believing that removing patients from unhealthy urban environments would speed their recovery. Whether the benefits were physical or psychological, escape from summer heat certainly seemed therapeutic to those who could afford it. Now let's contrast urban and rural experience more directly. Out in the countryside, where your grandmother still lives, and where most Americans still reside despite the urbanization trend, summer nights unfold differently. A farmhouse in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, perhaps 100 miles from your Philadelphia row house, experiences the same air temperatures as the city. The same sun bakes the same landscape, the same humidity hangs in the same atmosphere. But the farmhouse has advantages your row house lacks. First, there's space. The farmhouse stands alone or with only distant neighbours, surrounded by fields and pastures rather than other buildings. No shared walls radiate neighbours' heat into your rooms. The house can have windows on all four sides, allowing cross-ventilation when breezes blow. The building itself may be constructed differently, perhaps with a central hallway that channels airflow, or a second-story porch where sleeping outdoors is practical and safe. Second, there's thermal mass working in a different way. Rural buildings are often surrounded by vegetation, trees providing shade, grass and gardens absorbing heat rather than reflecting it. The earth itself, covered in living plants, stays cooler than cobblestone streets and brick sidewalks. The microclimate around a farmhouse differs meaningfully from the microclimate around an urban building. Third, there are options not available in the city. The hayloft, mentioned earlier, often sits above ground level where rising heat escapes through gaps in the roof boards. Sleeping in the barn, or on the porch, or under a tree in the yard, these are practical choices when you're not hemmed in by neighbours and social observation. Privacy in the countryside allows adaptations that city dwellers can't manage. But rural summer nights have their own challenges. Farm work continues regardless of temperature, and exhausted bodies need rest that the heat denies. Mosquitoes and other insects thrive in rural areas even more than in cities, with ponds and puddles providing breeding grounds everywhere. And the isolation that provides privacy also means no ice delivery, no shops for last-minute supplies, no nearby assistance if heat-related illness strikes. You think about your cousin on that Lancaster County farm, probably lying in his own pool of sweat right now despite the relative advantages of his location. Summer is hard everywhere, just differently hard depending on circumstances. The heat doesn't discriminate, but it does distribute its misery according to where and how you live. A mosquito whines past your ear, that distinctive high-pitched drone that signals a night is about to get worse. You wave your hand in the darkness, a futile gesture that accomplishes nothing except generating more body heat. The mosquito, or one of her sisters, will find you eventually. They always do. Summer nights in 19th century America belong to the insects. Humans may build the houses and sleep in the beds, but mosquitoes, flies, bed bugs, and various other six-legged creatures are the true owners of the darkness. Their dominion is so complete, so unchallenged, that you've simply learned to accept them as part of the package. A miserable part, but as unavoidable as the heat itself. Let's start with mosquitoes, since one is currently circling your head with malicious intent. The mosquito you're about to meet is almost certainly a female, since only females bite. They need the protein in blood to produce eggs. Males content themselves with plant nectar and spend their brief lives in comparative peacefulness. But the females are relentless, driven by biological imperative to seek out warm-blooded hosts, pierce their skin, and extract the blood necessary for reproduction. The mosquito finds you by following several sensory cues. Your body emits carbon dioxide with every exhale, and mosquitoes can detect this gas from remarkable distances, homing in on the plume of breath that marks you as a living target. As she gets closer, your body heat becomes detectable, a warm beacon in the relatively cooler surrounding air. And then there are the volatile chemicals in your sweat, lactic acid, ammonia, various other compounds that mosquitoes find irresistible. Tonight's mosquito lands on your forearm, her 6 legs settling so gently you barely feel the contact. Her proboscis, that needle-like mouth part designed for piercing skin, probes for a suitable blood vessel. When she finds one, she inserts the proboscis and begins to feed, simultaneously injecting saliva that contains anticoagulants to keep your blood flowing freely. It's that saliva that causes the allergic reaction you'll experience later, the itching, swelling, and irritation that make mosquito bites so annoying. You feel a tiny prick and slap at your forearm, but you're a half-second too late. The mosquito has already lifted off, carrying a belly full of your blood to fuel the next generation of tormentors. In her place, she's left a small wound that will soon begin to itch with maddening intensity. Here's the thing that makes mosquitoes more than merely annoying in this era. They carry diseases. Yellow fever, which can kill you in a week of fever and hemorrhaging. Malaria, which may not kill you directly but can leave you weakened and susceptible to other illnesses for years. Historians still argue whether malaria was endemic to North America before European colonization, or whether it arrived with enslaved Africans and their parasites. But by the 19th century it's firmly established throughout the South, and present in northern areas as well. You don't know about the connection between mosquitoes and disease. That discovery lies decades in the future, when researchers will finally prove that these insects are vectors for some of humanity's deadliest plagues. But you know that summer brings sickness along with heat, that people who survive the temperature sometimes succumb to fevers that seem to arrive on the evening air. The coincidence is real, even if the mechanism remains mysterious. Your bedroom is not equipped with any meaningful defense against mosquitoes. Window screens, those mesh barriers that will eventually become standard on American homes, are still rare and expensive in this era. The technology exists, wire mesh stretched across frames, but it hasn't achieved widespread adoption yet. Your windows either stay open, admitting insects along with air, or stay closed, eliminating the insect problem by creating a suffocating, airless box. Some households experiment with mosquito netting, fabric canopies draped around the bed to create a physical barrier between sleepers and biters. This practice is more common in tropical regions. European colonizers in Africa and Asia learned to use netting as protection against malaria-carrying mosquitoes, but it's starting to appear in American bedrooms as well. The netting works reasonably well if properly deployed, but it has significant drawbacks. It restricts airflow even more than bed curtains, it tangles easily, and any gap or tear renders it useless. You don't have netting on your bed. The expense seemed unnecessary for Philadelphia. This isn't the tropics after all, and now you're paying for that economy with repeated bites and constant vigilance. But mosquitoes are far from the only insects claiming residence in your bedroom. Let's talk about something that might be living inside your mattress right now. Bedbugs. Bedbugs are small, flat, reddish-brown insects that feed exclusively on blood. Unlike mosquitoes, which fly freely and bite exposed skin, bedbugs are homebodies. They live in the cracks and crevices of beds, furniture and walls, emerging at night to feed on sleeping humans. Their flat bodies allow them to hide in surprisingly small spaces, the seams of mattresses, the joints of bed frames, behind loose wallpaper. Bedbug bites are often more irritating than mosquito bites, causing itchy welts that can persist for days, but the psychological toll may be worse than the physical discomfort. Knowing that you're sharing your bed with parasites, that your mattress harbours colonies of blood-sucking insects waiting for you to fall asleep, this knowledge makes restful sleep nearly impossible. Bedbug infestations were extraordinarily common in 19th century America, so common that they were essentially expected in any well-used bed. Hotels were notorious for bedbugs, and travellers learned to inspect mattresses before settling in. But private homes were no more immune. Once bedbugs established themselves, they were almost impossible to eliminate with the methods available at the time. Treatments for bedbugs in your era include disassembling the bed frame and dousing it with boiling water, which kills any bugs and eggs at contacts but misses those hidden deeper in furniture joints. Some people apply turpentine or kerosene to cracks and crevices, hoping the toxic fumes will drive out or kill the insects. This occasionally works, but carries the obvious risk of fire. Mercury compounds are sometimes recommended, which are at least as dangerous to humans as to bugs. The truly desperate drag their mattresses outside and set them on fire, accepting the loss of expensive bedding as the price of temporary relief. But bedbugs can survive in wall cracks and floorboards, and they'll simply recolonise any new mattress brought into the infested room. Here's a quirky detail about 19th century bedbug management. Some people believe that certain types of wood naturally repel the insects. Sassafras and cedar are particularly favoured, and furniture makers sometimes advertise their beds as constructed from these supposedly protective materials. The science is questionable. Bedbugs aren't particularly deterred by aromatic woods, but the belief persists because people desperately want it to be true. Now let's add flies to your nocturnal zoo. Houseflies are ubiquitous in 19th century America, thriving on the abundant food sources that urban and rural life provide. Horse manure in streets, garbage in alleys, food waste in kitchens. During the day, flies are everywhere, but at night they mostly settle down to rest, mostly. In summer, when homes are open to catch any available breeze, flies enter freely and establish residence. They're less bothersome than mosquitoes while you're trying to sleep. They don't usually bite, and their buzzing tends to quiet after dark, but they're still present, landing on faces and hands, contributing to the general sense of being shared space with unwanted creatures. And then there are the regional specialties, fire ants in the south, whose painful stings can make sleeping on the ground truly hazardous. Sand fleas along the coast, tiny jumping insects whose bites itch for days. Various beetles, moths and crawling things that find their way into beds through windows, under doors and through cracks in walls. The overall effect is psychological as much as physical. You're not alone in your bedroom, ever. You share the space with a miniature ecosystem of creatures that view you as a food source, a habitat, or an obstacle to navigate around. The darkness is alive with movement and sound. Tiny legs walking, tiny wings beating, tiny mouthparts probing. You feel another mosquito land on your neck and slap at it successfully this time. A small wet smear confirms the kill, though you've probably just created a bloodstain on your nightshirt that will need laundering. Worth it, you decide. Your wife shifts beside you, scratching at her arm where something has apparently bitten her as well. "The bugs are bad tonight," she says, stating the obvious, with the weary resignation of someone who's had this conversation countless times. "Always are in July," you reply. The mosquito's surviving sisters continue their patrol of the room, waiting for you both to hold still long enough for them to feed. They have all night. They have all summer. They have evolutionary advantages honed over millions of years of hunting warm-blooded prey. You, by contrast, have your hands and your wits, which are growing duller by the hour. The insects plaguing your sleep are more than mere annoyances. They're carriers of death on wings too small to see properly in candlelight. Let's turn now to the diseases that stalk summer nights in 19th century America. the illnesses that make this season not just uncomfortable, but genuinely dangerous. Yellow fever sits at the top of the terror hierarchy, at least in coastal cities in the south. You've heard stories about it, read newspaper accounts, perhaps even known someone who died from it. The disease arrives mysteriously, often in port cities, often during the hottest months. First comes fever and chills, then nausea and aching. The lucky recover at this point. The unlucky progress to the disease's horrifying second stage, jaundice that turns the skin and eyes yellow, hence the name, vomiting of dark blood, bleeding from the gums and nose, and finally death. Yellow fever outbreaks have repeatedly devastated American cities. Philadelphia itself suffered a catastrophic epidemic in 1793, when the disease killed roughly 5,000 people, about 10% of the city's population, in just a few months. New York, Baltimore, Charleston, and New Orleans have all experienced their own epidemics. The disease seems to favour the summer heat, arriving when temperatures climb and disappearing when frost returns. No one in your era understands why yellow fever follows this pattern. The mosquito connection won't be proven until 1900, when Walter Reed's famous experiments in Cuba finally demonstrate that the Aedes aegypti mosquito transmits the disease. Until then, theories abound. Perhaps it spreads through foul air rising from swamps and garbage heaps, perhaps through contact with infected persons, perhaps through some mysterious quality of tropical atmospheres that occasionally wafts northward. What everyone knows is that summer brings yellow fever, and yellow fever brings death. When an outbreak begins, those who can afford to flee do so immediately, abandoning cities for the countryside until cold weather makes the streets safe again. Those who cannot flee, the poor, the working class, the enslaved, stay and take their chances. The term summer complaint covers a range of gastrointestinal illnesses that spike during hot weather. Dysentery, cholera infantum, various unspecified diarrheas. These diseases kill thousands every summer, particularly among infants and young children. The causes are what you'd expect: contaminated water, spoiled food, poor sanitation, and the general multiplication of bacteria that occurs when temperatures rise. An infant with summer complaint develops severe diarrhea, loses fluids faster than their small body can absorb them, and dies of dehydration within days or even hours. The mortality rate among children under 5 during summer months is shockingly high by modern standards. It's common for families to lose multiple children to these illnesses, common enough that some families hesitate to grow too attached to babies until they've survived a few summers and proven their resilience. Cholera deserves special mention, though it strikes in epidemics rather than as a consistent summer presence. Cholera arrived in America in 1832, sweeping through cities and killing tens of thousands. It returned in 1849 and would return again in later decades. The disease causes catastrophic fluid loss through vomiting and diarrhea. Victims can die within hours of the first symptoms, their bodies literally drained of water. Cholera is caused by contaminated water, though this connection is only beginning to be understood. John Snow's famous investigation of London's Broad Street pump outbreak occurred in 1854, demonstrating that cholera spreads through infected water supplies. But this knowledge is slow to penetrate American public health thinking, and cities continue to draw drinking water from rivers polluted with sewage. In summer, when heat encourages bacterial growth and people drink more water to compensate for sweating, cholera and other waterborne diseases flourish. Your pitcher of lukewarm water by the bed, which seems so essential for staying hydrated, might itself be a source of illness if your city's water supply is contaminated. Malaria, mentioned earlier in connection with mosquitoes, is endemic throughout much of America in this era. The disease doesn't usually kill quickly like yellow fever or cholera, but it weakens its victims through recurring cycles of fever, chills, and exhaustion. Once infected, you might carry the parasite for years, suffering periodic relapses whenever your immune system flags. Malaria is so common in some regions that people accept it as a normal part of life. The ague or the shakes are colloquial terms for malarial symptoms, and many communities have resident sufferers who shake with chills on predictable schedules. The disease reduces productivity, shortens lives, and contributes to the general debilitation of populations in affected areas. Quinine, derived from the bark of the cinchona tree, provides some relief from malaria symptoms and some prophylactic protection. It's available in your era, sold by pharmacists and patent medicine dealers, and it genuinely works, one of the few effective medicines in a landscape of useless nostrums. But quinine doesn't cure malaria, it just manages symptoms and reduces the severity of attacks. Once the parasite is in your body, it tends to stay. Typhoid fever is another summer scourge, spread through contaminated food and water. Like cholera, it thrives when sanitation is poor and temperatures are high. Typhoid progresses more slowly than cholera, a week or two of increasing fever, headache and abdominal symptoms. But it's still deadly, killing roughly 10 to 20% of untreated cases. Here's a grim detail about summer disease in 19th century America. Burial practices struggle to keep up with mortality during epidemics and heat waves. Bodies decompose rapidly in summer heat, creating public health hazards of their own. Gravediggers work overtime, cemeteries fill to capacity, and the smell of death mingles with the smell of garbage and sewage that already pervade cities. Death is not abstract in your era. It's visible, audible, and especially olfactory. Historians still argue whether 19th century Americans were psychologically more accepting of death because they encountered it so frequently, or whether the constant presence of mortality created pervasive anxiety that we can only imagine from our modern, sanitized distance. Probably both are true in different ways for different people. The medical response to summer diseases ranges from useless to actively harmful. Bloodletting remains popular despite mounting evidence that it weakens patients rather than curing them. Mercury compounds, praised for their dramatic effects, poison as many people as they help. Opium-based preparations provide comfort but not cure, and their addictive potential creates secondary problems. Some doctors are beginning to advocate for better sanitation, cleaner water, and improved living conditions as disease prevention. This sanitary reform movement will eventually transform public health, leading to water treatment, sewage systems, and building codes that make cities dramatically healthier. But that transformation lies mostly in the future. Tonight, you drink your lukewarm water and hope it's not carrying something that will kill you. The heat itself, independent of disease, poses its own dangers. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke claim lives every summer, particularly among workers who can't escape the sun. Symptoms progress from heavy sweating and weakness through confusion and elevated temperature to unconsciousness and death. The treatment, get the victim into shade, cool their body with water, provide fluids if they can swallow, is understood, but often applied too late to save those who've pushed beyond their limits. Infants are especially vulnerable to heat-related illness because their bodies can't regulate temperature as effectively as adults. Fever in a baby during a heat wave can be catastrophic, pushing already elevated temperatures into dangerous ranges. Parents watch their children anxiously during summer, alert for signs of overheating, knowing that the difference between life and death can be measured in degrees. The elderly face similar risks. Bodies weakened by age struggle to cope with thermal stress, and the cardiovascular strain of maintaining circulation in extreme heat can overwhelm compromised systems. Summer becomes a gauntlet for the old, a challenge to be survived rather than enjoyed. You're aware of these dangers in a general way. You've heard about people dying in heat waves. You've witnessed or heard about illness striking in summer. But the knowledge doesn't help you much right now, lying in your sweltering bedroom. You can't make the night cooler by understanding why it's dangerous. You can only endure. But let's talk about something more hopeful now, because even in this era of sweltering misery, humans are endlessly inventive when it comes to seeking comfort. Let's follow the ice, that precious frozen substance that represents, in the 19th century, the closest thing to air conditioning that money can buy. The ice trade is one of the great peculiar industries of your era, a commercial enterprise based on the simple principle that water freezes in winter and people want cold things in summer. It sounds obvious now, but the logistics of harvesting, storing and transporting ice across vast distances represent a genuine triumph of entrepreneurial vision and practical engineering. It all starts on frozen New England lakes during January and February. Picture this scene: a lake in Massachusetts or Maine, its surface covered in thick ice, perhaps 2 feet deep. Crews of workers gather in the bitter cold, wielding horse-drawn cutting machines and long saws. They score the ice into a grid pattern, then use long-handled tools to separate the blocks and float them to shore. The blocks are typically uniform. 22 inches on each side is common, for easier stacking and shipping. The harvested ice goes immediately into ice houses, structures designed with almost obsessive attention to insulation. The good icehouse has walls stuffed with sawdust or straw, minimal windows, and a floor that drains meltwater away from the stored ice. Some are built into hillsides, taking advantage of the Earth's natural insulation. Others are massive freestanding structures, cathedrals of cold that hold thousands of tons of frozen water. Inside these icehouses, blocks are stacked with sawdust packed between them, sawdust being perhaps the best insulating material widely available in your era. The sawdust absorbs the small amounts of melt that inevitably occur, preventing blocks from fusing together and allowing air circulation that helps maintain low temperatures. A well-built, well-managed icehouse can preserve ice for months, carrying winter's freeze deep into summer's heat. Then comes the shipping. Ice moves by wagon, by canal boat, by railroad, travelling from the frozen north to cities throughout America and, astonishingly, around the world. The ice trade isn't just domestic. American ice ships to the Caribbean, to South America, even to India and China. Entrepreneurs like Frederick Tudor, the ice king of Boston, built fortunes shipping New England ice to tropical destinations, where it arrived as a miraculous luxury. By the time ice reaches your neighbourhood in July, it's travelled a complex supply chain and passed through multiple hands. It arrives at the local ice house or ice depot, where a retailer portions it into smaller blocks for individual purchase. Ice wagons make rounds through city streets, the iceman cutting chunks to order from a large block in the back of his wagon, delivering them to households that can afford this cooling luxury. The Iceman himself is a recognisable figure in 19th century urban life, strong enough to carry heavy blocks with iron tongs, often working from before dawn to stay ahead of the day's heat. Children follow his wagon, hoping for chips of ice to suck on. Households display cards in their windows indicating how much ice they want delivered. £25, £50, £100, depending on their needs and their budget. What does ice cost? Prices vary by location and season, but in a typical city, you might pay around 2 cents per pound in early summer, rising to 3 or 4 cents during the hottest weeks, when demand peaks and supplies dwindle. A modest household might use £25 to £50 per week, meaning a summer ice budget of roughly $2 to $4 per month. Not insignificant for middle-class families, prohibitive for the working poor. Once you have ice, how do you use it? The icebox is the answer, a wooden cabinet lined with zinc or tin, with a compartment at the top for the ice block, and storage space below for food that benefits from cooling. Ice melts slowly in a well-insulated icebox, cooling the air around it and keeping contents like milk, butter and meat fresh, longer than they would otherwise last. Iceboxes represent a genuine quality-of-life improvement for households that can afford them. Food that would spoil in hours can last days. Butter stays firm instead of melting into greasy puddles. Drinks can be chilled. Imagine in this heat the luxury of a glass of water that's actually cold. But here's the limitation that matters tonight. An icebox doesn't cool you. It cools your food, your drinks, maybe a small surrounding area of your kitchen. But it can't make your bedroom comfortable. It can't make your mattress cool enough to sleep on without sweating. The ice sits in its wooden box, melting slowly, providing its limited benefits, while you lie upstairs in the heat, wishing you could somehow spread its cold throughout your entire house. Some people try direct cooling with ice. They place blocks in basins, hoping the cold radiating from the ice will lower the temperature of a room. This works marginally if you're standing directly next to the ice, but the cooling effect dissipates within a few feet, and ice is too expensive to use in the quantities needed to meaningfully cool a whole room. You'd need hundreds of pounds of ice per night, replaced constantly as it melted, far beyond any ordinary household's budget. Wealthy establishments sometimes attempt more ambitious ice cooling. Fancy restaurants, hotels and theatres might install systems where air passes over or through ice, and is then blown into public spaces. These early attempts at air conditioning provide noticeable relief to patrons, attracting customers who come as much for the coolness as for the food or entertainment. But these are commercial enterprises with commercial budgets. Residential versions aren't practical. Hospitals and nursing facilities sometimes use ice for patient comfort, recognizing that fever patients benefit from cooling. A feverish patient might be packed in ice, or have ice placed around their bed, or be fanned with air that's passed over ice blocks. Whether these treatments help medically is debatable, but they certainly provide psychological comfort to suffering patients. Here's a quirky detail about the ice trade. The quality of ice matters enormously. Ice harvested from pristine New England lakes clear, pure, free of pollution, commands premium prices. Ice from rivers or ponds near cities might be contaminated with sewage or industrial waste, and discerning customers learn to ask about the source of their ice. The irony is rich. People worry about impurities in ice while drinking water that's far more likely to be contaminated. Historians still argue whether the 19th century ice trade accelerated or delayed the development of mechanical refrigeration. On one hand, the ice trade proved that Americans would pay substantial sums for cooling, creating market demand that would eventually attract inventors. On the other hand, the ice trade provided a good enough solution that reduced the urgency of finding technological alternatives. Mechanical ice making does exist in your era, machines that use compression and evaporation cycles to produce ice without natural freezing. These early refrigeration systems are being deployed in industrial applications, breweries that need consistent cooling, meatpacking plants, certain manufacturing processes, but they're far too expensive and complex for household use. The idea of a refrigerator in every American home remains decades away. You think about ice now, lying in your hot bedroom. There's probably none left in your icebox. What little you purchased earlier in the week has long since melted, its cooling mission accomplished and ended. To get more, you'd have to wait until morning, until the ice wagon makes its rounds, assuming the ice house still has inventory. Ice often runs short during extended heat waves, when demand spikes just as the stored supply dwindles. What you'd give right now for a pile of ice, enough to cool this room, enough to lower your body temperature, enough to let you sleep. But ice is a luxury, a commercial product, a finite resource that melts by the hour no matter how carefully you try to preserve it. Instead, you have your warm water, your warm mattress, your warm air. The ice trade exists, but not for you, not tonight. Since ice is a luxury beyond tonight's reach, let's explore the more accessible cooling strategies that people actually use to survive summer nights. The homemade contraptions, folk remedies, and creative adaptations that represent humanity's desperate ingenuity in the face of heat. The wet sheet method is perhaps the most common nighttime cooling technique in your era. The concept is simple. Soak a sheet in water, wring it out until it's damp but not dripping, and then drape it over yourself or hang it in front of a window. As the water evaporates, it absorbs heat from your body or from the passing air, creating a cooling effect that can drop perceived temperature by several degrees. You've tried this before. It works, sort of. The initial sensation of a cool, damp sheet against your skin is genuinely pleasant, almost blissful in contrast to the dry heat you've been enduring. For perhaps 20 minutes you feel noticeably cooler and sleep seems possible, but then the sheet dries out. In the hot, dry air of your bedroom, the moisture evaporates faster than you'd like, and within an hour you're left with a clammy room temperature sheet that's neither wet enough to cool nor dry enough to be comfortable. You'd need to re-wet it repeatedly through the night, which means getting up, finding your water supply, probably limited, soaking the sheet, wringing it out, and returning to bed. A process that generates enough activity and frustration to fully wake you up, defeating the purpose. Some people hang wet sheets in front of open windows, creating an evaporative cooling effect for incoming air. This works better in theory than in practice. It requires a breeze to blow through the sheet, and on nights like tonight, when the air is still, the sheet just hangs there, drying slowly, providing minimal benefit. It also uses a lot of water, which isn't always abundant in urban areas. The damp nightshirt variation applies the same principle directly to your body. You soak your nightshirt in water, wring it out, and wear it to bed. The effect is more immediate than the wet sheet. The fabric is in direct contact with your skin, so the evaporative cooling happens right where you need it. But the same problem applies. The nightshirt dries out, and re-wetting it requires more effort than you want to expend when you're trying to sleep. Here's a regional variation. In the south, where humidity often makes evaporative cooling less effective, some people try the opposite approach. Instead of adding moisture, they minimize it, using fans and any available breeze to keep sweat evaporating from skin. The theory is that in humid air, you're already surrounded by moisture, so adding more doesn't help. Better to maximize airflow and let your body's natural cooling system do its work. Speaking of fans, let's discuss the fan situation. Mechanical fans, the electric ceiling fans and oscillating desk fans that future generations will take for granted, don't exist in your era. What does exist is the manual fan, that simple device consisting of a blade that you wave back and forth to create air movement. Hand fans come in many varieties. The simple folding fan, made of paper or fabric stretched over wooden or ivory ribs, is perhaps the most common. You snap it open, wave it at your face, and enjoy a small breeze. The problem is that waving a fan requires effort, and effort generates heat. The cooling benefit of the breeze is partially or entirely offset by the warmth you create through the exertion of fanning yourself. Wealthier households employ servants specifically to fan family members during the hottest periods. Imagine lying in bed while someone stands beside you, waving a large fan steadily, creating constant airflow without requiring any effort on your part. This is genuine luxury, not just the cooling effect, but the ability to relax completely while someone else does the work. The punka fan, common in British India, and sometimes adopted by Americans who've lived in tropical colonies, is a large ceiling-mounted fan operated by a servant pulling a cord, creating a back-and-forth motion that moves air throughout the room. You don't have servants. Your household is middle class, which means you do your own fanning, such as it is. Your wife keeps a small folding fan on her nightstand, and she uses it occasionally when the heat becomes truly unbearable, but she's tired too, and the effort of sustained fanning quickly exhausts her arm. Cellar sleeping represents another common adaptation to summer heat. The cellar or basement of a house maintains a relatively constant temperature year-round, typically in the low to mid-60s Fahrenheit regardless of surface conditions. This underground space offers genuine relief from summer heat. Descending into the cellar feels like entering a different climate entirely. Some families move their sleeping quarters to the cellar during the worst summer weeks. They carry down bedding and set up temporary sleeping arrangements among the preserved foods, stored equipment, and whatever else occupies that subterranean space. The floor is often dirt, which stays cool and slightly damp. The walls are stone or brick, massive and thermal stable. But cellar sleeping has significant drawbacks. The space is dark, often cramped, and rarely designed for human habitation. There's no ventilation except what comes through the cellar door, which means air can become stale and unhealthy. Rats, mice, and insects often claim the cellar as their territory. And there's something psychologically uncomfortable about sleeping underground, especially for people who associate cellars with storage, root vegetables, and the occasional flood. Some houses have summer kitchens, separate structures or additions built specifically to keep cooking heat away from the main house during summer. When the day's cooking is done, these spaces might serve as cooler sleeping quarters, taking advantage of their physical separation from the heat-absorbing main building. Porches serve similar functions. A broad porch on the shaded side of a house can be noticeably cooler than indoor rooms, especially if it catches prevailing breezes. People sleep on porch floors, on porch swings, on any horizontal surface that offers access to outdoor air. The practice is more acceptable in rural areas, where neighbours are distant and privacy less of a concern, but urban dwellers sometimes resort to porch sleeping as well. Here's a folk remedy that you might have heard from your grandmother. Placing a cool, damp cloth on your pulse points, wrists, neck, ankles, to lower body temperature. This actually works reasonably well. Blood vessels run close to the surface at these points, and cooling the blood there helps reduce core body temperature. It's a targeted approach that uses minimal water for maximum effect. Some people sleep with their feet dangling off the bed, or with their feet pointing toward an open window, believing that cooling the extremities helps cool the whole body. The science here is mixed. Feet are good radiators of heat, so exposing them might help, but the psychological comfort of feeling cooler feet shouldn't be underestimated. Alcohol is sometimes used as a cooling agent, applied to the skin rather than consumed. Wiping alcohol on your forehead or wrists creates a strong evaporative cooling sensation as the volatile liquid rapidly evaporates. The effect is temporary but intense, and some people swear by it for getting through the worst moments of a hot night. The obvious drawback is that alcohol is expensive compared to water, and using it for skin cooling seems wasteful when it could be drunk instead. Speaking of drinking, let's acknowledge that many people turn to actual alcohol consumption as a heat management strategy. The theory is that alcohol relaxes you, making the heat easier to bear, and perhaps induces drowsiness that helps you fall asleep despite discomfort. The reality is that alcohol dehydrates you, disrupts sleep quality, and raises core body temperature, all exactly the opposite of what you need on a hot summer night. But people don't know this in your era, and they keep doing it anyway. The clock strikes 1 and the sound reaches you through the darkness as if travelling through water, thick, slow, reluctant. You've now been lying in this bed for approximately 3 hours, and sleep remains as distant as ever. Let's listen for a moment to the sounds of a summer night in 19th century America, that symphony of suffering that surrounds you. Start with the house itself. Your row house, like all row houses, makes noise. Wood expands and contracts with temperature changes, and the day's heat is still working its way through the structure, causing beams and floorboards to shift and settle. You hear creaks and pops from unexpected directions, sometimes the walls, sometimes the ceiling, sometimes from somewhere below. These sounds are familiar enough to ignore most of the time, but on a sleepless night, they punctuate the silence like random percussion. The window frame nearest your bed has developed a slight rattle over the years. When there's any breeze at all, the sash vibrates against the frame, producing a faint but persistent knocking sound. Tonight there's no breeze, so the window is silent, but you're almost wishing for the rattle because at least it would indicate air movement. Your wife's breathing fills the space beside you. She's not asleep either. You can tell by the rhythm, by the occasional adjustment of position, by the small sighs of frustration she releases when she thinks you're not listening. But you're both pretending, maintaining the fiction that the other might be sleeping, careful not to disturb a rest that isn't happening. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaks. It might be one of the children, awake and restless in the heat, moving around their room. It might be nothing, just the house settling, continuing its nocturnal conversation with itself. You wait to see if it repeats, if small footsteps will approach your door, but silence returns. Maybe they're sleeping after all. Children sometimes can, despite everything, their young bodies finding surrender where adult minds resist. Outside your window, the city maintains its reduced but persistent nighttime activity. You hear a horse's hooves on cobblestones, a late carriage returning from somewhere, or perhaps an early delivery wagon getting a head start on the day. The rhythm is distinctive, clip-clop, clip-clop, then the rattle and squeak of wheels, then gradually fading as the vehicle moves away down the street. Dogs communicate across the neighbourhood, a conversation conducted in barks. One begins, perhaps triggered by the passing horse, and others respond from different directions. The barking exchange can last several minutes, each dog apparently compelled to contribute its voice, before finally dying out into resentful silence. Human voices drift up from the street level, muffled by distance but occasionally intelligible. A pair of men pass beneath your window, talking too loudly for this hour, probably returning from a tavern. You catch fragments. Something about work, something about a woman, a burst of laughter that seems obscene in the quiet night. Then they're gone, their footsteps fading around the corner. From a few houses down comes the sound of a crying baby, that thin, persistent wail that cuts through walls and distance. The baby has been crying off and on for the past hour, and you feel a mixture of sympathy and irritation. The parents must be exhausted trying everything they know to soothe an infant who's too hot to sleep, too uncomfortable to settle. You remember when your own children were that small, those endless summer nights of walking and rocking and praying for quiet. The baby's cries trigger a response from your wife, who shifts position again and makes a small sound of sympathy. "That poor little thing," she murmurs. "Someone should—" She trails off, not completing the thought because there's nothing to be done. The baby is hot. The baby is miserable. The parents are doing their best. This is simply what summer is. Insects contribute their own layer to the soundscape. Mosquitoes whine near your ears, announcing their intentions before attacking. Crickets chirp from the small patch of yard behind your building. In the country, cricket sound might be pleasant, but here it just adds to the chorus of things keeping you awake. Somewhere, the distinctive buzzsaw rhythm of a cicada cuts through the night, that aggressive seasonal sound that seems to embody summer itself. The fire company goes past, bells clanging, horses galloping. You sit up briefly, alert for the smell of smoke, listening for shouts that would indicate nearby danger. Fire is a constant fear in wooden cities, especially in summer when everything is dry and tinder-ready. But the engine keeps going, the bells fading into distance, and you lie back down. Whatever's burning isn't close to you. Tonight at least, you're safe from that particular threat. Here's a detail that might surprise future generations. Nights in 19th century cities are never truly quiet. The modern expectation of nighttime silence is a product of sound insulation, zoning laws, and noise ordinances that don't exist yet. In your era, people live stacked against each other in ways that make privacy of sound impossible. You hear your neighbours' arguments, their lovemaking, their snoring, their nightmares. They hear yours, The couple who lives in the building attached to your north wall are having some kind of discussion right now. Their voices penetrate the shared brick, muffled but emotionally legible. There's tension. You can hear that even without distinguishing words, and occasional sharp exchanges that suggest a disagreement about something significant. You try not to listen, but in the silence of a sleepless night, there's nothing else to focus on. From somewhere further away comes music. Someone is playing a piano, probably poorly, at an hour when such activity should be forbidden. The notes drift through the heavy air, a melody you vaguely recognise but can't quite identify. The playing stops and starts, as if the pianist is working through a difficult passage, trying again and again to get it right. You wonder if they're also suffering from insomnia, using music to fill the empty hours rather than lying in bed waiting for sleep that won't come. A ship's horn sounds from the river, a long, low note that seems to vibrate through the humid atmosphere. The waterfront is several blocks away, but sound carries strangely on nights like this. The horn might be a ship arriving, departing, or simply announcing its presence in the darkness. River traffic doesn't stop for summer heat. Commerce continues regardless of human comfort. Your own body contributes to the soundscape. Your stomach gurgles, processing the dinner you ate hours ago. Your joints crack when you shift position. Your breathing, normally silent, seems loud in your own ears, each exhale a small contribution to the room's stuffiness. Historians still argue whether 19th century people experienced sound differently than we do, whether the constant ambient noise of their environments raised their threshold of attention, or whether they were more attuned to acoustic detail because they lacked our technological distractions. Probably both are true. You've learned to sleep through sounds that would wake a modern person instantly, yet you're also aware of subtle variations in the nighttime soundscape that future generations would never notice. The clock begins to chime again, once, twice, marking 1:30. The night is not quite half over. By 2 a.m, if you're still awake, and of course you are, your thoughts begin turning toward radical solutions. Inside isn't working. The house is a box of heat, and you're trapped in it. Maybe the answer is to abandon the house entirely and seek relief in the open air. This is not a fringe idea. Across America, millions of people are coming to the same conclusion on summer nights. They're dragging their bedding out of their suffocating rooms and finding sleeping spots wherever outdoor air might be even slightly cooler than indoor air. In New York City, the practice has become so common that it's essentially normalized. On the hottest nights, fire escapes transform into makeshift bedrooms, their iron platforms supporting entire families who've fled the oven-like interiors of tenement apartments. People lie on these metal grids, their bodies arranged to avoid falling through the railings. Their bedding minimal because any fabric is too much in this heat. The fire escapes weren't designed for sleeping. They were designed, as the name suggests, for escape from fires, narrow platforms and ladders providing emergency egress from upper floors. But when every other option has failed, when the choice is between sleeping on a metal grate in the open air or not sleeping at all inside a broiling room, the fire escapes become beds. People adapt. People always adapt. Rooftops are another option for those who can access them. The roofs of urban buildings capture heat during the day, but also release it faster than the interior spaces once the sun is down. If there's any breeze at all, the roof catches it while the street canyons below remain still. Families bring their mattresses up steep stairs or through roof hatches, establishing temporary sleeping areas under the stars. Rooftop sleeping has its hazards, obviously. People occasionally roll off, especially children, or those who move in their sleep. The surfaces are often uncomfortable, tar and gravel, or in some cases sloped and unstable. And there's no protection from rain if the weather turns, which means grabbing bedding and fleeing downstairs at the first drops of an unexpected storm. But when weighed against the alternative, another sleepless night in a room that feels like a slow-cooking oven, the rooftop starts to seem like a reasonable choice. In cities with public parks, the grass becomes a bed for hundreds or thousands of people during heat waves. Central Park in New York, which opened in 1858, sees families camping on its lawns during the worst summer nights. Battery Park at Manhattan's southern tip, with its slightly cooler ocean breezes, attracts crowds seeking relief. These impromptu sleeping gatherings are tolerated, more or less, by authorities who recognise that prohibiting them would just shift the problem elsewhere. The social dynamics of outdoor sleeping are complicated. During the day, the park is public space, democratically accessible to anyone who chooses to visit. But claiming a spot to sleep overnight feels different. more intimate, more vulnerable. Families stake out territory, establishing their small camps with blankets and perhaps a lantern. They eye nearby strangers with a mixture of wariness and solidarity, uncertain whether to welcome the company or guard against the risk. Here's a quirky detail about park sleeping. People try to recreate the comforts of home even in these public spaces. They bring pillows, familiar blankets, sometimes even small pieces of furniture. A mother might bring her children's favourite toys, hoping that familiar objects will help them settle despite the strange surroundings. The goal is to make the outdoors feel enough like the indoors that sleep becomes possible, while also escaping the indoor heat that makes sleep impossible. Police patrol these sleeping crowds, ostensibly to maintain order but also to provide a measure of security. Theft is a concern. Personal belongings left in open spaces are vulnerable, and the presence of uniformed officers helps discourage predatory behaviour. The relationship between police and outdoor sleepers is mostly cordial during heat waves, a temporary truce based on shared recognition of extraordinary circumstances. Back in your Philadelphia row house, you're considering your own outdoor options. Your house has a small backyard shared with your neighbours and mostly filled with a privy and some scraggly vegetation. It's not exactly an idyllic sleeping environment, but it would put you in open air rather than trapped within walls. The problem is visibility. Your yard isn't private. Neighbours' windows overlook it, and anyone passing through the alley that runs behind the row houses could see you lying there. The prospect of being observed while sleeping, of being vulnerable in view of others, makes you hesitate. It's one thing to sleep outside in a public park where everyone else is doing the same. It's another to lie in your own backyard like a homeless person, which is how it would appear to anyone who didn't understand the circumstances. There's also the question of what to sleep on. Dragging your mattress outside seems excessive. It would be damaged by any morning dew, and the neighbours would definitely notice. A blanket on the ground is an option, but the ground is hard, uneven, and probably home to insects and other creatures you'd rather not share sleeping space with. Some people find middle ground solutions. Sleeping on the porch, if you have one, keeps you outdoors while providing some privacy and elevation from the ground. Sleeping in a hammock allows air circulation beneath your body in a way that mattresses don't. Sleeping in a wagon or cart, if you have access to one, provides a mobile bedroom that can be positioned for optimal airflow. You think about the time years ago when you and your wife slept outdoors during a particularly brutal heat wave. You'd spread blankets on the porch floor, brought pillows outside, and spent the night watching stars between fitful bouts of drowsing. It had been better than staying inside, though still far from comfortable. Your wife had worried about what the neighbours would think, and you'd risen before dawn to move everything back inside before anyone could see. Tonight you're tempted to do it again, but inertia holds you in place. Getting up would require effort. Gathering bedding would require coordination. Your wife seems to be sleeping, or at least lying very still, and you don't want to disturb her with your restlessness. Instead, you lie here, fantasizing about outdoor air, watching the ceiling in the darkness, waiting for morning or sleep, whichever comes first. The children who sleep outside on summer nights will remember those experiences for the rest of their lives. There's something magical about it, despite the discomfort. The stars overhead, the sounds of the city in darkness, the sense of adventure and emergency combined. These nights become family stories, passed down through generations. Remember when it was so hot we slept in the park? Remember when Grandpa carried us all to the roof? But for now, in this moment, it's just hot and you're just tired and the night goes on. As the night deepens, let's consider for a moment who isn't lying in an airless bedroom right now, and how their summer experience differs from yours. Because in 19th century America, as in every era, wealth buys comfort, and the wealthy have options for escaping summer heat that you can only imagine. The rich flee. It's as simple as that. When summer settles over eastern cities, those with means pack their families into carriages and trains and boats, heading for cooler destinations where the heat is something read about in newspapers rather than endured in person. The mountains beckon first. The Catskills of New York, the Berkshires of Massachusetts, the White Mountains of New Hampshire. These elevated regions offer temperatures that can run 15 to 20 degrees cooler than lowland cities. At 2,000 feet of elevation, a summer night that would be brutal in Philadelphia becomes merely pleasant, even requiring a light blanket. Mountain resorts have sprung up to accommodate this seasonal migration. The Catskill Mountain House, perched dramatically on a cliff overlooking the Hudson Valley, has become one of the most famous hotels in America. Its broad piazzas offer sweeping views and cooling breezes, and its guest register reads like a social directory of wealthy families escaping the heat. Similar establishments dot the mountain ranges throughout the Northeast, each offering its own version of elevated comfort. The seashore provides another escape route. Newport, Rhode Island has transformed from a colonial port town into a summer playground for America's elite. Its oceanfront properties hosting families who spend entire seasons away from their urban mansions. Cape May, New Jersey, attracts Philadelphia's wealthy to its beaches and hotels, where sea breezes make sleeping possible, and where fashionable society recreates itself in a coastal setting. Think about what this means for a wealthy family. In June, as temperatures begin to climb, servants are dispatched ahead to open the summer house, whether in the mountains or by the shore, preparing it for the family's arrival. Clothing and necessities are packed into trunks and shipped by wagon or rail. The family itself travels in relative comfort, perhaps in a private railroad car if they're truly wealthy, arriving at their summer destination before the worst heat strikes. They'll spend July and August in this cooler climate, reading newspapers that report on the heat waves killing the poor back home. The father might commute occasionally to the city for business, enduring a few days of discomfort before returning to his family's retreat. But the mother, the children, and the household servants who've accompanied them will stay in place, experiencing summer as a season of leisure rather than survival. Historians still argue whether this seasonal migration contributed to class tensions or relieved them. On one hand, the visible departure of wealthy families while the poor remained to suffer could inspire resentment. On the other hand, the absence of the wealthy meant reduced competition for jobs and resources in the city, and might have eased some social pressures. The practice also shaped urban geography in lasting ways. Cities that served as summer destinations for the wealthy, Newport, Saratoga Springs, the various mountain resort towns, developed economies centered on seasonal tourism. They built grand hotels, established entertainment venues, and created infrastructure to serve visitors who arrived with money and expectations of comfort. Some of these communities retain their tourism orientation to this day, their histories shaped by 19th century Americans fleeing summer heat. Middle-class families like yours participate in this migration to a limited extent, if at all. You might afford a week at a seashore boarding house if you save carefully, or a brief trip to visit relatives in the countryside. But the extended summer residence, the mountain house, the seaside cottage, the months-long escape from urban heat, is beyond your means. You're stuck in Philadelphia, sweating through July and August while reading about the pleasures enjoyed by those who can afford to leave. Here's a quirky detail about 19th century summer resorts. They developed their own social calendars, independent of urban society. At Newport or Saratoga, the summer residents establish routines of visiting, entertainments and social events that occupy their leisured days. Young people meet potential marriage partners under circumstances that would never occur in the city. Business connections are made on hotel verandas over iced drinks. The summer resort becomes a separate social world, accessible only to those who can afford both the financial cost and the time commitment. This social separation has long-term consequences. The wealthy increasingly socialize primarily with each other, meeting at summer resorts, winter resorts, exclusive clubs, and private events. The casual mixing of classes that might occur in urban streets becomes less frequent as the wealthy spend more time in controlled environments. Some historians argue that the summer resort phenomenon contributed to the hardening of class divisions in late 19th century America. Back in your bedroom, you're aware of this wealthy world only through newspapers and gossip. You know that rich families leave when summer comes. You know they have houses in the mountains, cottages by the sea, places of retreat that exist specifically for comfort. You don't resent them exactly. Their wealth seems as natural and inevitable as the weather itself. But you do sometimes wonder what it would feel like to simply leave when things became unbearable. Your employer, for instance, is currently at his family's summer place in the Poconos. The business continues in his absence, managed by clerks and assistants, but the man himself is comfortably ensconced in a mountain house where nights are cool and sleep comes easily. He'll return after Labor Day, refreshed and tan, while you'll still be here, exhausted from a summer of sleepless nights, working the same hours you've always worked. There's a democratic impulse in America that resists this kind of inequality, but there's also a capitalist impulse that accepts it as the natural reward of success. If you are wealthy, You'd flee the heat too. Anyone would. The wealthy are just doing what everyone would do if they could. And maybe, with hard work and good fortune, you'll someday join them. But not tonight. Tonight, you're here. In this row house. In this heat. Waiting for a dawn that brings no relief and a day that brings more of the same. Let's turn now to those who suffer most in the summer heat. The ones who can't flee to the mountains, can't afford ice, can't even claim a fire escape or rooftop for relief. Children and the elderly die in heartbreaking numbers during 19th century summer heat waves, their fragile bodies unable to withstand what stronger constitutions endure. Start with infants. A baby born in spring enters its first summer with a body that hasn't yet developed efficient temperature regulation. Infants can't sweat as effectively as adults, can't communicate their distress clearly, can't take action on their own behalf. They depend entirely on parents who are themselves exhausted, overheated, and often poorly informed about the dangers their children face. An infant in a tenement room on a hot summer night is in genuine peril. The baby's small body absorbs heat from the surrounding environment, its core temperature rising as the room's temperature climbs. The mother perhaps tries everything she knows, removing the baby's clothing, fanning the child, offering breast milk or water. But if the room itself is 95 degrees, and the baby's temperature rises to 104 or 105, there's no way to cool down. Heat exhaustion in infants progresses rapidly to heat stroke. The baby becomes listless, stops crying, feels hot and dry to the touch. Seizures might occur. Without aggressive cooling, ice baths, cold compresses, measures that most families can't provide, the baby dies, and thousands do die, every summer, in cities and countryside across America. The term summer complaint covers many of these deaths, lumping together heat-related illness with gastrointestinal diseases that also spike in warm weather. Newspapers report mortality statistics that would horrify modern readers. Hundreds of infant deaths per week in major cities during heat waves. The statistics become numbing, just numbers on a page. But each number represents a baby who was alive and then wasn't. Parents who expected to raise a child and instead had to bury one. Historians still argue whether 19th century parents were psychologically protected from this grief, by expecting it, by knowing that child mortality was high and therefore not investing as deeply in individual children, or whether the grief was just as acute, just more frequently experienced. Probably the answer varies by individual, by community, by circumstance. Some parents seem to have maintained emotional distance from infants who might not survive. Others were devastated by losses despite their frequency. The elderly face different but equally serious risks. Older bodies have less efficient thermoregulation than younger ones. The cardiovascular system, which must work harder to circulate blood and dissipate heat, is often compromised by age and disease. Older people may be less aware of their own dehydration, less likely to seek help, less able to take protective action. An elderly person in a hot room might simply stop functioning. Their heart, overtaxed by the effort of cooling the body, gives out. They become confused, unable to communicate their distress or take appropriate action. They die alone in their beds, discovered hours or days later by family members or neighbours. During major heat waves, morgues overflow with elderly victims. The death certificates might list heart failure or exhaustion rather than explicitly blaming the heat, but the temporal correlation is clear. When temperatures spike, elderly deaths spike with them. The pattern is so consistent that newspapers in this era have begun tracking it, publishing heat-related mortality statistics alongside temperature readings. Working-class families face particular challenges in protecting their vulnerable members. Children can't be supervised constantly when both parents must work. Elderly relatives can't be moved to cooler locations when the family has no cooler location to move them to. The economic necessity of survival sometimes conflicts directly with the health and safety of the most vulnerable family members. Consider a working mother in a tenement building. She has an infant and a 2-year-old, and she must work, perhaps as a seamstress, perhaps as a laundress, perhaps in one of the many other occupations that employ women in cities. She can't stay home with her children during the day. The family needs her wages. So the children are left with a neighbour, or with an older sibling, or sometimes essentially alone. The heat is as dangerous for them as for any other children, but no one is watching closely enough to intervene if something goes wrong. Ice, which might cool a feverish child, is too expensive for many families. Cold water baths, another emergency cooling measure, require water that must be carried from a public pump. Even the simple act of keeping children hydrated is complicated by poverty. Clean water isn't always available, and contaminated water causes its own deadly diseases. Here's a detail that suggests how normalised child mortality was. Life insurance policies in this era often specifically exclude children under a certain age, reflecting the actuarial reality that infants were poor risks. Some policies even required that children survive to a specified age before coverage began. The insurance industry, in its cold, numerical way, acknowledged what families experienced emotionally. Young children died frequently, and planning for their future was inherently uncertain. Despite this normalisation, or perhaps because of it, some charitable organisations began focusing specifically on protecting children from summer heat. Fresh air funds, ice distribution programmes, and summer outings to the countryside aimed to give poor children temporary relief from urban heat. These early public health initiatives recognised that summer was deadly for the young, and that intervention could save lives. The fresh air movement, which gained momentum in the latter half of the 19th century, sent urban children to the countryside for summer weeks. The theory was that fresh air, clean water, and escape from city heat would improve children's health and reduce mortality. Whether the benefits came from the actual fresh air, the improved nutrition, the temporary escape from overcrowded conditions, or some combination of factors, the program did seem to help. Children who participated in fresh air programs were less likely to die than those who stayed in the city. But these programs couldn't help everyone. Most children in urban slums never received fresh air fund assistance, never escaped the heat, never experienced the countryside. They stayed in their tenements, playing in streets and alleys, drinking whatever water was available, and dying at rates that modern public health standards would find unconscionable. You think about your own children, asleep, you hope, in their room down the hall. They're healthy, thank God, strong enough to survive the summer so far, but you worry about them, as all parents worry. The heat is dangerous and children are vulnerable, and there's only so much you can do to protect them. The clock has given up counting hours that matter. We're somewhere in the deep trough of night now, that territory between 2 and 4 a.m, when everything seems eternal and sleep seems impossible. Let's talk about what people drink to survive these summer nights, because hydration matters, and the beverages available in 19th century America are a complicated mix of necessity, tradition, and outright danger. Water is the obvious choice, the fundamental human need, but water in this era is not what you might imagine. The water supply in most American cities is contaminated to degrees that would horrify future generations. Rivers serve simultaneously as drinking water sources and sewage disposal systems. Wells are often too close to privies, allowing groundwater contamination. Municipal water systems exist in some cities, but the treatment is minimal at best. The water in your bedside pitcher came from a public pump, or perhaps from a well in your backyard. It's been sitting in that pitcher since evening, reaching room temperature, and probably hosting a growing population of microorganisms. You drink it because you're thirsty, and because there's no alternative, but it might be making you sick even as it keeps you alive. People in this era are vaguely aware that water quality varies. They notice that water from some sources tastes better, or seems safer than water from others. They observe that certain neighbourhoods have higher rates of illness than others. But the germ theory of disease is only beginning to gain acceptance, and the connection between contaminated water and specific illnesses isn't fully understood. Cholera epidemics have begun to change this understanding. John Snow's famous investigation of London's Broad Street pump outbreak demonstrated that cholera spread through contaminated water, not through bad air as previously believed. This finding is filtering into American public health thinking, but slowly. Most people still drink whatever water is available, trusting that if it looks clear and smells acceptable, it's probably fine. Here's the irony of summer hydration. People need more water precisely when water is most dangerous. Hot weather encourages bacterial growth in water supplies. Higher temperatures accelerate decomposition of organic matter in rivers and wells. The same heat that makes you desperately thirsty also makes your water supply more likely to kill you. What about alternatives to water? Beer is widely consumed and actually safer than water in many cases. The brewing process, boiling and fermentation, kills many harmful organisms, and the alcohol content inhibits further bacterial growth. Light beer, or small beer, with low alcohol content, is considered appropriate for everyday consumption, including by children. Your family might drink beer with meals throughout the summer, not to get drunk, but simply because it's less likely to cause illness than water. Cider serves a similar function in apple-growing regions. Hard cider, fermented from apple juice, is a staple beverage for many families. It's refreshing, slightly alcoholic, and generally safer than untreated water. Cider houses and taverns serve it by the glass to thirsty customers seeking something cool, well, room temperature to drink. Milk is available but problematic. In cities, milk is often contaminated, either at the source or during transport and storage. Swill milk from urban dairies, cows fed on distillery waste and kept in appalling conditions, is notorious for causing illness, particularly among infants. Even clean milk spoils rapidly in summer heat, becoming dangerous within hours of milking. Ice can extend milk's safe consumption window, but ice is expensive. Tea and coffee are safer than water because they require boiling, which kills pathogens. But they're also hot, which makes them unappealing in already hot weather. Some people cool their tea or coffee with ice, creating primitive iced beverages, but this is an expensive indulgence. Historians still argue whether 19th century Americans drank enough fluid to maintain proper hydration. The beverages available were often less than ideal, and the fear of contaminated water might have led some people to drink less than they should. Chronic mild dehydration could have contributed to the fatigue and malaise that people associated with summer heat, symptoms we'd recognise as signs of insufficient fluid intake. Alcohol complicates the picture. Many people drink whiskey, rum, gin, or other spirits, especially in the evening and especially in summer when thirst drives increased consumption. Alcohol feels refreshing going down, and its psychoactive effects might temporarily distract from heat-related discomfort. But alcohol is a diuretic, increasing urine production and actually contributing to dehydration. Heavy drinking on hot nights can be genuinely dangerous, accelerating fluid loss and impairing judgment about when to seek relief from heat. Temperance advocates in this era have begun warning about the dangers of alcohol in summer heat, adding this health argument to their moral objections. They point out that alcohol impairs the body's ability to regulate temperature, that drunk people are more likely to die in heat waves, that the tavern culture that flourishes in summer is contributing to preventable deaths. These arguments have some scientific merit, though they're often mixed with moralizing that diminishes their credibility. Your own drinking habits are probably moderate by the standards of your era. You might have a glass of beer with dinner, perhaps some whiskey on special occasions, nothing that would mark you as intemperate. But tonight, lying in your hot bedroom, you're aware of a mild headache that might be dehydration, a thirst that warm water doesn't quite satisfy. You think about the pitcher by your bed and wonder whether drinking more will help or hurt. Here's a quirky detail about summer beverages. Some people believe that hot drinks are actually more cooling than cold ones. The theory is that a hot drink causes you to sweat, and the evaporation of sweat cools your body more effectively than the direct cooling of a cold drink. This belief has some basis in physics. Evaporative cooling is indeed effective, but it ignores the immediate discomfort of consuming hot liquid in already hot conditions. Still, you might encounter people in this era drinking hot tea on summer days, insisting that it's the most refreshing choice. Ice water, when available, is considered the ultimate summer luxury. The sensation of genuine cold liquid entering a hot body is almost miraculous, a brief experience of what summer could be if money were no object. But ice water also carries risks. Drinking large amounts of very cold liquid too quickly can cause stomach cramps and digestive distress. Some people believe cold drinks are inherently dangerous, capable of shocking the system in harmful ways. These beliefs are mostly wrong, but they're held sincerely. Lemonade is becoming popular as a summer beverage, especially among those who can afford sugar and lemons. The combination of sweet, sour and cold, if ice is available, creates a refreshing drink that feels specifically designed for hot weather. Street vendors sell lemonade in cities, and households with means make their own. It's a drink associated with summer leisure, with porches and parties, and the kind of genteel socialising that heat waves interrupt. But you have no lemonade tonight. You have warm water, the possibility of going downstairs for beer, and the certainty that whatever you drink, you'll continue to sweat it out faster than you can replace it. The night goes on. If you've been breathing through your mouth to avoid the smell, now is the time we need to address that directly. The smell of a 19th century American city in summer is something no description can truly capture, but let's try anyway. Because the olfactory assault is part of what makes summer nights so miserable, not just the heat, but the reek of a world without modern sanitation. Start with the horses. Horses are everywhere in 19th century cities, providing the motive power for transportation, delivery and industry. A large city might have tens of thousands of horses producing collectively hundreds of thousands of pounds of manure every single day. This manure falls in the streets, is trampled by pedestrians, is spread by wagon wheels, and sits in piles until someone, eventually, shovels it away. In summer, horse manure bakes in the sun. The smell intensifies as temperatures rise, becoming a nearly physical presence that coats the inside of your nose and throat. Even in your bedroom, with windows closed, the smell penetrates. It's the smell of the city itself, as fundamental as the smell of wood smoke in winter, or rain on spring pavements. But horse manure is just the beginning. Add human waste to the mixture, because sanitation in this era is primitive at best. Most homes have privies, outdoor toilets consisting of holes in the ground over which you sit, and these privies accumulate waste until they're full, at which point they're either emptied or simply abandoned while a new one is dug nearby. Privy emptying is a nighttime occupation, performed by night soil men, who cart away the accumulated human waste under cover of darkness. The process is exactly as unpleasant as it sounds, men shoveling excrement from holes in the ground into carts, which are then hauled to designated dumping areas outside the city. The smell during emptying is overwhelming, often waking entire neighbourhoods, and the dumping areas themselves become permanent sources of stench, polluting the air for miles downwind. Cesspools serve wealthier homes that have indoor plumbing of a sort. Pipes carry waste from indoor facilities to underground chambers, where it accumulates until the cesspool overflows or is emptied. These systems are barely better than privies. The cesspools leak into groundwater, the emptying process spreads contamination, and the smell permeates the surrounding area. Sewers exist in some cities, but they're rudimentary by modern standards. They carry waste directly to rivers without treatment, converting waterways into open sewage channels. The rivers themselves become reeking corridors of contamination, especially in summer when low water levels concentrate the pollution. If you live near a river, and many people do since rivers are economic centres, you live near an open sewer. Garbage adds its own contribution to the summer smell. Household waste in this era includes food scraps that decompose rapidly in heat, generating odours and attracting flies. Collection systems are inconsistent. Garbage might sit in streets or alleys for days before anyone removes it. Some households keep pigs to consume food waste, adding animal smell to the mixture. Others simply dump garbage in the street, hoping rain will eventually wash it away. Industrial smells layer onto the biological ones. Tanneries process animal hides using chemicals and processes that generate horrific odours. Slaughterhouses kill and butcher animals, producing rivers of blood and piles of offal that rot in summer heat. Rendering plants boil animal carcasses to extract fat, creating smells that can make people physically ill. These industries are often located near residential neighbourhoods, their owners unable or unwilling to pay for distance from population centres. Here's a detail that might seem almost absurd. Some people believe that bad smells themselves cause disease. The miasma theory holds that illness arises from foul air, from the noxious vapours that rise from swamps, garbage heaps and human waste. While this theory is wrong about the mechanism, germs, not smells, cause most diseases, it's right about the correlation. Places that smell bad often are unhealthy, because the same conditions that produce foul odours often produce disease transmission. Your bedroom, fortunately, is not directly adjacent to the worst smell sources. You're a few blocks from the river, far enough from tanneries and slaughterhouses to avoid their specific stenches. But the general city smell, horse manure, human waste, rotting garbage, unwashed humanity, permeates the air you're breathing right now. It's part of the atmosphere, as constant as the humidity. On hot nights, when windows must be opened for any hope of airflow, the smell enters directly. You've grown accustomed to it mostly. Your nose has adapted, adjusting its sensitivity to filter out the constant background stench. But sometimes, when the wind shifts, or a particular source intensifies, the smell breaks through your adapted tolerance, and you're reminded of just how bad it is. Historians still argue whether 19th century people experienced their olfactory environment differently than we would, whether their adapted noses literally couldn't smell things we would find unbearable. or whether they simply learned to ignore smells that they could still technically detect. Probably there's truth to both possibilities. The human nose does adapt to constant stimuli, reducing perception of unchanging smells. But even adapted noses can still detect variations, and the 19th century urban nose was certainly detecting something. The smell affects sleep in ways both direct and indirect. Directly, unpleasant odours can make it harder to relax, harder to achieve the mental calm that precedes sleep. Indirectly, the smells carry health implications that your subconscious might register even when your conscious mind has adapted. The body knows, on some level, that breathing contaminated air is dangerous. Some people try to combat the smell with countermeasures. Burning incense or aromatic herbs produces pleasant smells that can mask unpleasant ones. Vinegar splashed around rooms was believed to purify air and combat miasmas. Lavender and other fragrant flowers might be placed near beds in hopes of creating a pleasant olfactory environment. None of these measures actually address the underlying contamination, of course. They're attempts to make the unbearable slightly more bearable, to carve out a small pocket of pleasantness in an ocean of stench. You breathe shallowly, trying not to think about what you're inhaling. The night air feels thick not just with heat and humidity, but with particulate matter, dust, pollen, microscopic fragments of everything that makes the city smell the way it does. You're breathing horse manure, essentially, along with human waste and rotting food and industrial chemicals and everything else that floats in urban air. But you've been breathing this air your whole life, and you're still alive. The body adapts, the mind adjusts, and the night goes on, smell and all. Dawn is still hours away, but let's think forward to what it will bring. Another scorching day, another round of work that must be accomplished regardless of temperature. The people who labour through 19th century summers face challenges that make your overnight discomfort seem almost trivial. Start with factory workers, who spend their days inside buildings that function essentially as ovens. A textile mill, for instance, generates enormous amounts of heat from machinery running constantly, from bodies packed closely together, from minimal ventilation designed to keep cotton fibres from escaping. Workers in these mills, many of them women and children, labour in temperatures that can exceed 110 degrees, breathing air thick with cotton dust and humidity. The pace of work doesn't adjust for temperature. Machines run at the same speed regardless of weather, and workers must keep up or lose their jobs. There are no breaks for cooling off, no provisions for extra water, no recognition that human bodies have limits. Workers collapse from heat exhaustion. They're carried outside, revived if possible, and often sent back to work. Deaths occur, not often enough to shock anyone, but often enough to be acknowledged as occupational hazard. Domestic servants face their own summer torture. The kitchen, in any household, is the hottest room. Cooking requires fire, and fire generates heat that accumulates in enclosed spaces. A servant preparing meals for a family spends hours standing over a hot stove, in a kitchen that might reach unbearable temperatures by midday. The ironing that follows cooking is done with heavy flat irons heated on that same stove, adding more heat exposure to an already exhausting day. Wealthy families sometimes install summer kitchens, separate structures built specifically to keep cooking heat away from the main house. This helps the family but not the servants, who simply relocate their suffering from one hot room to another. The summer kitchen might even be worse, since it's often a smaller, more poorly ventilated structure than the main house's kitchen. Laundresses work with boiling water in summer as in winter. The laundry process requires heating large quantities of water, soaking clothing, scrubbing, boiling, and then hanging items to dry. In summer, this work generates oppressive heat and humidity while the workers themselves are drenched in sweat. The combination of heat, hard physical labour, and constant exposure to moisture creates conditions that modern occupational health standards would find unacceptable. Here's a quirky detail about summer labour. Some industries actually prefer hot weather because it makes certain processes easier. Bakers find that bread rises faster in summer heat. Construction workers dealing with mortar appreciate that it sets more quickly. These modest advantages barely compensate for the human cost, but they're noted nonetheless by employers who see temperature primarily through the lens of productivity. Outdoor labourers face direct sun exposure that indoor workers are spared, though the trade-off of fresh air versus heat radiation isn't always favourable. Construction workers on building sites, dock workers, loading and unloading ships, street pavers and road workers, all these men labour under a sun that beats down relentlessly during the hottest months. Heat casualties among outdoor workers are common enough to be newsworthy when they occur in clusters. A particularly brutal day might kill several workers across a city, their deaths reported in newspapers alongside temperature readings. Fatal heat headlines appear regularly during summer months, documenting a phenomenon that everyone knows, but that still shocks when the numbers accumulate. The working day typically runs from 6 in the morning to 6 in the evening, sometimes longer. These 12-hour shifts mean that workers are exposed to the full range of daily temperatures, from the relative coolness of early morning through the brutal peak of afternoon. There's no air-conditioned refuge, no opportunity to escape the worst heat. You work until your shift ends, and then you go home to another hot night of attempted recovery. Some employers make minimal accommodations for summer heat. They might provide drinking water, though not always clean drinking water, at work sites. They might allow slightly longer breaks during the hottest hours, though lost productivity is resented. They might distribute salt tablets based on the theory that replacing lost sodium helps prevent heat illness. Whether these measures help significantly is debatable. They certainly don't make summer work pleasant. Historians still argue whether 19th century workers had legal recourse against unsafe working conditions, including extreme heat exposure. In theory, workers who were injured on the job could sue employers for negligence. In practice, such lawsuits were difficult to win, expensive to pursue, and often resulted in blacklisting from future employment. Most workers simply accepted summer conditions as part of the job, suffering in silence or dying without protest. The economic pressure to work despite dangerous heat falls most heavily on the poor. A skilled worker might have some bargaining power, some ability to negotiate conditions. An unskilled labourer has none. There are always others willing to take a job regardless of conditions. The heat-related deaths that occur disproportionately among the working poor reflect this power imbalance as much as any physical vulnerability. Your own work situation is better than many but hardly comfortable. You work indoors, in a counting house or office, where at least you're shaded from direct sun. But your workplace has the same ventilation problems as your home: small windows, thick walls, air that sits heavy and unmoving. By mid-afternoon on hot days, the office feels like a steam bath, and concentration becomes nearly impossible. Your employer doesn't adjust schedules for temperature. The work must be done, the ledgers must be balanced, the correspondence must be answered. You sit at your desk, sweat dripping onto the papers before you, trying to maintain focus while your body screams for relief. The evening brings no escape, just the transition from one hotbox to another, from the hotbox of work to the hotbox of home. You think about tomorrow, about the day of labour that awaits you after this sleepless night. You'll be exhausted before you start, already depleted by hours of heat and restlessness. The thought makes sleep seem even more desperately necessary, which somehow makes it even more elusive. In the small hours of the night, when the body's exhausted and the mind grows strange, people sometimes turn to higher powers for explanation and relief. Let's consider how religion and morality intersected with summer suffering in 19th century America, because the heat wave you're enduring isn't just a meteorological event, it's a spiritual challenge that demands interpretation. Many preachers of this era view extreme weather as divine communication. Droughts, floods, storms and heat waves are God speaking to his people, either in punishment or in warning. A brutal summer might be understood as heavenly displeasure with collective sin, a call to repentance and reform. The suffering of the poor and vulnerable becomes, in this interpretation, a consequence of society's moral failures. This theological framework has practical implications. If heat waves are divine punishment, then the appropriate response is spiritual rather than material. Prayer, fasting, confession of sins, renewed religious observance. These are the measures that will bring relief. Public days of prayer might be declared, calling entire communities to collective repentance in hopes of turning away God's wrath. Historians still argue whether this religious interpretation of weather was sincerely held by most people, or was primarily a tool of social control wielded by religious authorities. Probably both were true. Many people genuinely believed in divine providence and found meaning in understanding weather through spiritual lens, while religious leaders also used weather events to encourage desired behaviours and discourage undesired ones. The specific sins believed to provoke divine displeasure varied by preacher and denomination. Sabbath breaking was a common target. Working or engaging in leisure activities on Sunday was widely condemned. and heat waves might be attributed to collective failure to keep the Sabbath holy. Drinking, gambling, prostitution, and other urban vices also featured prominently in sermons, explaining why God was punishing cities with unbearable heat. Interestingly, the suffering of the innocent, children dying of heat exhaustion, elderly people succumbing to heat stroke, was rarely allowed to undermine the divine punishment narrative. Theodicy, the problem of explaining evil and suffering in a world governed by a good God, has exercised religious thinkers for millennia, and 19th century preachers had their own solutions. Innocent suffering might be understood as testing, as mysterious divine purpose beyond human comprehension, or as consequences of others' sins that fell upon bystanders. Some religious communities responded to summer heat with practical charity as well as spiritual exhortation. Churches and religious organizations distributed ice, provided cool spaces for the suffering, and organized charitable outings to bring urban poor to cooler locations. The same religious impulse that interpreted heat waves as divine punishment also motivated efforts to relieve the suffering of heat victims. Here's a quirky detail about religion and summer. Some communities debated whether it was appropriate to modify church services during heat waves. Services in this era were often lengthy, 2 hours or more of preaching, prayers and hymns, and churches were frequently the hottest buildings in town, packed with bodies, poorly ventilated without any cooling. Should services be shortened for safety? Should they be moved outdoors? Should dress standards be relaxed to allow lighter clothing? Conservative voices argued that proper worship required proper form, regardless of discomfort. God's house should not be treated casually, and the faithful should be willing to suffer for their spiritual benefit. More progressive voices argued that endangering congregants' health served no divine purpose, and that modifications were not only acceptable but morally required. The moral dimensions of summer extended beyond religion into broader social ethics. Questions about who suffered and who escaped, about responsibility for protecting the vulnerable, about the proper role of government in ensuring public health. All these questions took on heightened urgency during heat waves that killed people by the hundreds. Some voices began arguing that summer mortality wasn't just a natural phenomenon or divine judgment, but a social problem with social solutions. Better housing, improved sanitation, public parks and bathing facilities, workplace regulations, ice distribution programs. These measures could reduce heat-related deaths, making suffering a matter of policy rather than fate. This perspective, sometimes called the sanitary reform movement, would eventually transform American public health. But in your era, it's still a minority viewpoint. The intersection of class and morality complicated discussions of summer suffering. The wealthy, who escaped to mountains and seashores, were sometimes criticized for abandoning their civic responsibilities. Shouldn't the fortunate share their good fortune, provide relief to those who couldn't afford to flee? Or were the wealthy entitled to enjoy the fruits of their success, while the poor bore consequences of their own failures to achieve similar security? Protestant work ethic, deeply embedded in American culture, suggested that poverty itself was a moral failing. The poor were poor because they lacked industry, thrift, and virtue. If they possessed these qualities, they would be wealthy enough to escape summer heat like respectable people. This brutal logic justified indifference to suffering, attributing heat-related deaths to personal inadequacy rather than structural inequality. Catholic and other immigrant communities often had different perspectives, shaped by traditions that placed greater emphasis on communal responsibility and charity toward the poor. Ethnic neighborhoods sometimes organized mutual aid, sharing resources to protect vulnerable members from summer heat. These efforts operated outside the Protestant establishment, often invisible to mainstream observers, but they saved lives nonetheless. You yourself probably hold some mixture of these views, absorbed from your upbringing and community without much critical examination. You believe in God? Probably. You believe that weather has meaning beyond mere meteorology? Probably. You believe that people have some responsibility for their own circumstances, but also that charity toward the less fortunate is virtuous. These beliefs coexist without necessarily being reconciled into a coherent philosophy. Lying in your hot bedroom, you might offer a prayer for relief, not a formal prayer necessarily, but a kind of mental appeal to whatever power governs the universe. Please let it rain. Please let the heat break. Please let me sleep. Whether God hears such prayers, whether he responds, whether the heat wave will end tomorrow or continue for weeks, these are mysteries beyond human understanding. The night goes on, neither answered nor unanswered, simply endured. The newspapers will have plenty to say about this heatwave when it finally ends, assuming you survive to read them. Journalism in 19th century America has begun treating extreme weather as news, documenting the human toll of summer heat, with growing attention and occasional outrage. Let's examine how the press covered the deadly summers of this era, and how that coverage contributed to the slow emergence of public health awareness. Heatwave journalism typically follows a predictable pattern. First come the temperature readings, thermometer at 95 in the shade, establishing the meteorological facts. Then come the human interest stories, the labourer who collapsed at his workplace, the infant who died in a tenement, the elderly woman found dead in her room. Then, if the heatwave continues long enough, come the mortality statistics, the cumulative toll that transforms individual tragedies into public health crisis. Newspapers in this era occupy a different position in society than their modern descendants will. They're numerous. Major cities have dozens of papers serving different audiences, different political affiliations, different ethnic communities. They're partisan, editorializing freely, advocating for causes, attacking enemies. And they're influential. In an era before radio, television, or internet, newspapers are the primary source of information about events beyond immediate personal experience. When newspapers begin covering heatwave deaths, they're creating public awareness that didn't exist before. A baby dying in a tenement might go unnoticed by anyone outside the immediate neighbourhood. A newspaper story about that death reaches thousands of readers, many of whom never think about conditions in the tenements. Cumulative mortality statistics compiled and published make visible a pattern that individual deaths obscure. Here's how a typical heatwave story might read. Yesterday proved fatal to numerous citizens, the excessive heat claiming victims among the young and old alike. At 54 Mulberry Street, an infant of 3 months succumbed to heat prostration despite the efforts of its agonised mother. On the docks, 2 labourers fell stricken and died before medical assistance could arrive. The total deaths attributed to heat in this city now exceed 100 for the month of July. Notice the tone, matter-of-fact, slightly sensational, treating deaths as news while also treating them as somewhat inevitable. There's sympathy for victims, but little questioning of the conditions that produce victims. The heat is presented as natural phenomenon, like an earthquake or flood, against which human measures are largely futile. Some newspapers begin pushing beyond this passive frame. Reform-minded journalists connect heat deaths to housing conditions, to workplace practices, to the absence of public services that could provide relief. They argue that heat mortality is not inevitable but preventable, that deaths among the poor represent failures of social organisation rather than unavoidable tragedy. Historians still argue whether newspaper coverage of heat waves contributed to public health reforms, or simply reflected growing reform sentiment that would have developed anyway. Probably the relationship ran both ways. Journalism both reflected and reinforced changing attitudes, creating feedback loops that accelerated social change. The competition among newspapers creates pressure towards sensationalism that sometimes distorts coverage. A paper might exaggerate death tolls or dramatise individual cases to attract readers, prioritising entertainment value over accuracy. The line between journalism and advocacy blurs as papers with reform agendas use heatwave coverage to advance their causes. Illustrations begin appearing alongside heatwave stories, making the suffering visible as well as readable. An image of a tenement family crowded into a sweltering room, or workers collapsed on a construction site, or children sleeping on fire escapes. These images communicate more viscerally than words alone. Illustrated newspapers become powerful tools for building public awareness and sympathy. Letters to the editor provide a venue for public response to heatwave coverage. Citizens write in with suggestions for relief, with criticism of city officials, with stories of suffering and survival. These letters reveal the range of public opinion on summer heat. Some see it as inevitable misfortune, others as failure of social responsibility, others as divine judgment on sinful cities. Here's a quirky detail about 19th century journalism. Some newspapers publish home remedy advice for heat survival, alongside their mortality reports. Keep wet cloths on the head. Avoid spirituous liquors. Bathe frequently in tepid water. Do not sleep in the sun. This advice, often medically questionable, represents an early form of public health communication, attempting to reduce harm through education. The newspapers also report on official responses to heat waves, or more often, on the absence of adequate responses. City governments are criticised for failing to provide sufficient ice, to open cooling stations, to regulate workplace conditions. Officials are quoted making excuses, promising future action, or simply expressing helplessness in the face of natural forces beyond their control. Over time, this journalistic attention contributes to changing expectations. If newspapers report on heat deaths every summer, if they document the preventable nature of much suffering, if they criticise officials who fail to act, then public pressure builds for improvement. The coverage creates standards against which reality can be measured and found wanting. In your era, this evolution is still incomplete. Heatwave coverage exists, but the public health framework that will eventually guide responses is still developing. You read about deaths in the papers. You might even recognise some victims by name or neighbourhood. But the systemic analysis that would demand systemic solutions is only beginning to emerge. Tomorrow or the next day you'll read about tonight's casualties in whatever paper you favour. The dead will be listed, their neighbourhoods identified, their causes of death attributed to heat exhaustion or sunstroke or some similar term. You'll feel a moment of sympathy, perhaps of there but for grace recognition. And then you'll turn the page, and life will continue until the next heatwave brings the next round of deaths and the next round of coverage. The newspaper sits on your hall table downstairs, yesterday's edition, filled with yesterday's heat deaths. Tomorrow's edition will have more. The night goes on. A dog begins howling somewhere in the neighbourhood. A long, mournful sound that seems to capture the collective misery of every creature suffering through this night. Let's turn our attention now to the animals of 19th century America, because humans aren't the only ones dying in summer heat, and the animal casualties reveal something important about how this world operates. Horses are the most visible victims. These massive, hard-working animals provide the muscle power that makes urban life function, pulling carriages, wagons, streetcars and industrial equipment. They work long hours on cobblestone streets that radiate stored heat, pulling loads that would strain them even in comfortable temperatures. On hot days, horses collapse. You've seen it happen. The animal suddenly faltering, legs buckling, massive body crumpling onto the street. Sometimes the horse is just exhausted and can be revived with water and rest. Sometimes the horse is dying, its heat-stressed body shutting down beyond any possibility of recovery. Dead horses are common sights on summer streets, their carcasses creating obstacles and hygiene hazards until city services can haul them away. The numbers are shocking when someone bothers to count them. During severe heat waves, hundreds of horses die in major cities over the course of a few days. New York might lose 200 horses in a single week of extreme heat. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, all the horse-dependent cities experience similar casualties. The economic loss is significant. Horses are expensive animals, and their deaths cost owners real money. But the suffering of the horses also evokes human sympathy in ways that might surprise modern observers. The Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, founded in 1866, begins advocating specifically for working horses during heat waves. They distribute watering troughs, push for regulations requiring drivers to rest their animals, and prosecute particularly egregious cases of overworking horses in dangerous heat. Here's a detail that reveals the complexity of animal welfare in this era. Horses that collapse and can't work are often simply shot where they fall. A horse that can no longer pull its load has no value to its owner and represents only an expense for feed and care. The most efficient solution is to end the animal's life and purchase a replacement. This harsh economic calculation applies to working animals throughout 19th century America. Dogs and cats suffer summer heat too, though their suffering is less visible than that of working horses. Stray animals, and there are many in 19th century cities, have no access to shade or water. They pant in alleys, seek whatever shelter they can find, and sometimes die quietly in corners where their bodies might not be discovered for days. Pets in households fare better but still struggle. Dogs in particular suffer from heat. Their fur coats, designed for retaining warmth, become liabilities in summer. Panting helps, but there's only so much cooling a dog can achieve when the ambient temperature exceeds body temperature. Some dog owners shear their animals for summer, a practice that helps but goes against aesthetic preferences for full-coated breeds. Farm animals face their own summer challenges. Cattle need enormous quantities of water in hot weather, and if water sources dry up or become contaminated, the animals sicken and die. Pigs, lacking effective sweat glands, seek mud wallows for evaporative cooling. Without access to mud, they overheat rapidly. Chickens reduce egg production in extreme heat, adding economic loss to animal suffering. The animal casualties of summer heat waves serve as a kind of early warning system for human casualties. Animals and humans share the same thermal environment. When horses start collapsing, humans are at risk too. The visibility of horse deaths sometimes prompts public health responses that benefit humans as well. If authorities act to reduce animal casualties, some of those measures, increased water availability, shorter working hours during peak heat, help human workers too. Historians still argue whether 19th century Americans viewed animal suffering with the same moral weight as human suffering, or whether animal welfare was primarily an economic concern dressed in humanitarian language. Probably both perspectives coexisted, with genuine compassion for animals mixed with practical calculations about the cost of losing valuable livestock. The howling dog outside your window continues its lament. You can't see the animal, can't know why it's howling. Heat distress, loneliness, response to some stimulus you can't perceive. But the sound captures something about this night that human language struggles to express. The pure, inarticulate misery of creatures suffering in conditions beyond their control. You think about your own household's animals, if you have any. A cat, perhaps, who's found the coolest spot in the house and lies there motionless, conserving energy. A dog who pants constantly and drinks water as fast as you can provide it. These animals don't understand why they're uncomfortable. They just experience discomfort without context or hope of explanation. In some ways, their suffering is more complete than yours. You at least know that heat waves end, that autumn will eventually arrive, that this misery is temporary. They know only the eternal present of heat. The night goes on, and somewhere in the darkness another horse falls. Let's step back from this single July night and consider a particularly brutal chapter in American heat history. The Civil War summers, when soldiers on both sides faced not just enemy bullets, but temperatures that killed as effectively as any weapon. The Civil War was fought primarily in the American South during months that included the hottest of the year. Armies of young men, most of them accustomed to cooler northern climates, marched and fought through Virginia, Tennessee, Georgia and other southern states during July and August heat that could exceed 100 degrees. Consider the uniform these soldiers wore. Wool. Federal Army regulations specified wool uniforms year-round, and while some modifications were made for summer, lighter-weight wool, more loosely woven fabrics, the basic requirement remained. Soldiers marched in wool coats, wool trousers, wool caps, carrying heavy packs and weapons, under a southern sun that showed no mercy. The results were predictable and devastating. Heat casualties exceeded combat casualties in some units during summer campaigns. Men fell out of marching columns, unable to continue. Soldiers collapsed during the physical exertion of battle, succumbing to heat before enemy fire could reach them. Field hospitals received as many heat stroke victims as wounded men during the hottest periods. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought in early July 1863, took place during a heat wave that added to the battle's horror. Temperatures reached the high 80s and low 90s, and the physical demands of fighting, charging across open fields, engaging in hand-to-hand combat, dragging wounded men to safety, pushed soldiers beyond their thermal limits. Bodies lay on the battlefield after the fighting ended, decomposing rapidly in the summer heat, creating a stench that witnesses described as overwhelming. Here's a detail that captures the desperate adaptation soldiers made. Some units abandoned their wool coats during summer marches, preferring to risk disciplinary action rather than certain heat exhaustion. Officers faced the impossible choice of enforcing regulations that would kill their men, or tolerating violations that undermined military discipline. Most chose survival over rules, though some did not. The Confederate Army, fighting on home ground, had some advantages in the heat. Southern soldiers were more acclimated to the climate, and Confederate uniforms were often lighter and more loosely regulated than their Federal counterparts. But Southerners still suffered from heat exhaustion, especially during the grueling campaigns of the war's later years when supplies ran short and endurance was stretched to breaking. Water became a tactical concern as critical as ammunition. Armies needed enormous quantities of water to maintain their men and horses, and summer campaigns often turned on access to water sources. Streams and wells that seemed adequate could be quickly depleted by thousands of thirsty soldiers. Contaminated water, and almost all available water was contaminated to some degree, caused disease that killed more soldiers than combat across the war. Historians still argue about the extent to which summer heat shaped Civil War strategy and tactics. Some generals clearly took temperature into account, timing their movements to avoid the worst heat or positioning their forces near reliable water sources. Others seemed to ignore thermal conditions entirely, marching their men through midday heat that could have been avoided with better planning. The medical understanding of heat illness was rudimentary during the Civil War era. Doctors recognised heat stroke and heat exhaustion as distinct conditions but had limited ability to treat either effectively. The standard treatment, moving the victim to shade, providing water, applying cool compresses, helped if applied early, but could do little for severe cases. Men who progressed to high fevers and unconsciousness usually died. Camp conditions during summer were particularly brutal. Soldiers lived in canvas tents that absorbed and held heat, creating interior temperatures well above the ambient air. Sanitation was poor, water supplies were contaminated, and the close quarters spread disease rapidly. The summer camp was in some ways more dangerous than the summer battlefield. The memories of Civil War veterans, recorded in the decades after the conflict, frequently mention the heat alongside the horror of combat. These men, who faced death daily and witnessed atrocities that would haunt them forever, still remembered the suffocating southern summers as among the worst things they endured. Heat suffering became part of the war's legacy, alongside the battles and casualties. You might know a Civil War veteran, or know of one. The war ended only recently in your timeline, or perhaps you're living through its aftermath. The men who returned from southern campaigns carry heat memories in their bodies as well as their minds. Some developed chronic conditions attributed to their summer exposure. Others simply remember, in the way that soldiers remember, what it felt like to march through hell in a wool coat. But there's hope on the horizon, not for tonight, not for this summer, but for future generations who will eventually escape the tyranny of summer heat. Let's look at the innovations beginning to emerge in the late 19th century, the technologies and ideas that will eventually transform human relationship with temperature. The electric fan represents the first practical step toward mechanized cooling. Before electricity, fans required human or water power, someone pulling a cord, or a water wheel driving a belt system. These methods worked but were expensive and limited in application. With electricity, a small motor can spin fan blades indefinitely, creating constant airflow without constant human effort. Electric fans begin appearing in the 1880s and 1890s, first in commercial applications where the expense can be justified, then gradually in wealthier homes. The experience of sitting in front of an electric fan, feeling artificial breeze blow across sweaty skin, seems almost miraculous to those who first encounter it. The fan doesn't actually cool the air, it's still the same temperature, but moving air accelerates evaporation of sweat, creating the sensation of cooling that makes summer more bearable. The ceiling fan, electrically powered, transforms interior spaces. Mounted high, spinning continuously, it moves air throughout a room, preventing the stratification that makes ceiling-level temperatures much higher than floor-level temperatures. A room with a ceiling fan feels dramatically more comfortable than the same room without one, even though the thermometer would show identical readings. Here's a quirky detail about early electric fans. They were sometimes seen as health hazards. The same miasma theory that made people fear night air made some people fear artificial air movement, believing that the disturbed air might spread disease or cause illness. These fears were unfounded, but they slowed adoption of fan technology among the cautious. Beyond fans, more ambitious cooling technologies were beginning to develop. Mechanical refrigeration, which had existed in industrial form since the mid-century, was being refined and miniaturized. The basic principle, compress a gas, let it release heat, then allow it to expand and absorb heat from surroundings, was well understood. Applying that principle to cool living spaces rather than just preserve food was the next logical step. Ice-making machines had proven that artificial cold was possible. Instead of harvesting ice from frozen lakes and shipping it south, factories could manufacture ice year-round, anywhere there was power to run the compressors. This technology was transforming the ice industry, reducing dependence on weather and geography, making cold a manufactured commodity rather than a natural resource. The idea of using similar technology to cool buildings rather than just make ice was being explored by the 1890s. Early experiments showed promise. Theatres and public buildings could be made noticeably cooler through mechanical systems that circulated chilled air. But the cost was enormous, the technology unreliable, and the scale limited to special applications. Willis Carrier, who would eventually invent practical air conditioning in 1902, was still a young man in your timeline, perhaps not even born yet, depending on exactly when you're lying in your hot bedroom. His breakthrough, understanding that humidity control was as important as temperature control for human comfort, still lay ahead. But the pieces were coming together, the scientific and engineering knowledge accumulating that would make his invention possible. Improved building design also offered paths to summer relief. Architects began incorporating ventilation theory into their work, designing buildings with features that promoted natural airflow, high ceilings, transom windows, central hallways that channeled breezes. These passive cooling techniques couldn't match the dramatic effects of mechanical systems, but they could make buildings noticeably more comfortable without energy consumption. The public health movement contributed ideas about urban planning that would affect summer temperatures. Parks and green spaces, advocates argued, provided not just recreation but cooling. Trees shaded the ground, grass absorbed less heat than pavement. Open spaces allowed air circulation that dense development prevented. The creation of Central Park and similar urban green spaces was motivated partly by desire to reduce the thermal intensity of cities. Water infrastructure improvements had similar effects. Drinking fountains provided access to water during hot days. Public bathhouses allowed people to cool their bodies through immersion. Fire hydrants in some neighbourhoods were opened during heat waves to create improvised cooling stations for children and adults alike. Historians still argue whether these late 19th century improvements constituted real progress towards summer comfort, or were merely modest mitigations of a fundamentally unchanged thermal reality. The answer is probably both. Conditions improved marginally while remaining brutal by modern standards. The arc of history bent toward comfort, but bent slowly. You know nothing of air conditioning lying in your hot bedroom? The concept would seem like science fiction, like a story from one of Mr. Verne's novels. A machine that makes cold air, that can cool an entire house, that allows summer to feel like autumn. Such things seem as impossible as flying to the moon, but they're coming. Not tonight, not this decade, perhaps not this century, but someday your descendants will sleep through July nights in perfect comfort, and they will barely imagine what you're enduring right now. The 1890s would bring some of the deadliest heat waves in American history, events that finally forced cities and governments to confront summer heat as a public health emergency rather than a natural inevitability. Let's examine these catastrophic events and their lasting impact. The heat wave of 1896 stands out as particularly devastating. In August of that year, temperatures across the eastern United States soared to levels that overwhelmed all coping mechanisms. New York City was hit especially hard, experiencing nearly 2 weeks of temperatures exceeding 90 degrees, with humidity that made the air feel even hotter. The death toll was staggering. In New York alone, more than 1,000 people died directly from heat-related causes, with additional thousands dying from complications exacerbated by heat stress. These numbers didn't include deaths that went unreported or were attributed to other causes. The actual mortality was certainly higher, perhaps much higher, than official statistics suggested. Bodies overwhelmed the city's morgue facilities. The dead were stored in any available cold space, ice company warehouses, beer brewery cellars, while authorities struggled to process them. Funerals backed up for days. Families waited to bury their dead while bureaucracy and heat competed to complete decomposition. The victims were disproportionately poor, disproportionately immigrant, disproportionately residents of the tenement districts where housing was worst, and escape was impossible. But the heat also killed middle-class and even wealthy New Yorkers, demonstrating that while money provided protection, it couldn't guarantee survival. Here's a detail that captures the desperation of that week. Police officers were ordered to spray down crowds with fire hoses, using water pressure to create cooling spray that people gathered under. Ice was distributed at police stations. Municipal piers were opened for public sleeping, allowing people to lie on wooden platforms over the cooling water of the harbour. These emergency measures saved lives, but they also revealed how unprepared the city was for predictable annual emergencies. The 1896 heatwave prompted investigative journalism that examined the structural causes of heat mortality. Reporters documented the conditions in tenement buildings, the lack of ventilation, the impossible choices facing families with nowhere to go. They connected housing policy to death tolls, arguing that building codes and landlord practices were killing people as surely as the weather. Police Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt, yes, that Theodore Roosevelt, future president, personally toured the tenement districts during the 1896 heatwave and was appalled by what he saw. His experience contributed to his later advocacy for housing reform and public health improvements, demonstrating how heatwave crises could shape political consciousness. The political response to 1896 was substantial if incomplete. New York and other cities began developing heat emergency protocols, free ice distribution, cooling stations, shortened working hours during heat emergencies. Building codes were strengthened to require better ventilation in new construction. The idea that government had responsibility for protecting citizens from heat became more widely accepted. Similar heat waves struck in later years, 1901, 1911, each one adding pressure for reform while claiming its own toll of victims. The 1911 heat wave killed over 1,000 people in New York alone, demonstrating that progress was painfully slow. The lessons of 1896 had not been fully learned. The same conditions that produced mass death in that year still existed 15 years later. Historians still argue whether the heat waves of the 1890s represented a turning point in American public health, or simply another episode in an ongoing struggle. The reforms they prompted were real but limited. Summer continued to kill people by the hundreds throughout the early 20th century, until air conditioning finally provided the technological solution that policy measures couldn't achieve. The legacy of these heat waves extends beyond immediate policy changes. They established precedents for government response to weather emergencies, precedents that would later be applied to blizzards, hurricanes, and other disasters. They contributed to the growing expectation that cities should protect their residents from predictable dangers. They made heat mortality visible in ways that demanded response. You may or may not live to see the great heat waves of the 1890s, depending on your age and circumstances. If you do, you'll recognize them as extreme versions of the suffering you're experiencing tonight, the same misery, amplified to deadly intensity, claiming victims by the thousand. But tonight is tonight, and the 1890s are the future, and all you know is that the heat goes on. Summer nights in 19th century America weren't just survived, they were also in their way lived. The shared experience of heat suffering created cultural adaptations that shaped American life in ways that persist long after air conditioning made them unnecessary. Let's examine what summer nights meant for American culture, the traditions and customs born from collective heat endurance. The front porch emerged as America's summer living room, a transitional space between the unbearable interior and the slightly less unbearable exterior. Families gathered on porches in the evening, escaping hot indoor spaces, seeking whatever breeze might stir the humid air. The porch became a site of socializing, of watching the world pass by, of conversations with neighbors doing the same thing on their own porches. Porch culture fostered a kind of community intimacy that later generations, retreating to air-conditioned interiors, would largely abandon. You knew your neighbors because you saw them every evening, sitting on their porches, available for conversation. You watched children grow up, observed courtships developing, tracked the rhythms of family life across the street and down the block. The porch was a stage for domestic life, and everyone in the neighborhood was simultaneously performer and audience. Rocking chairs became symbols of summer leisure, their gentle motion creating a slight breeze for the seated person, while requiring minimal exertion. The image of elderly people rocking on porches, slowly moving through hot summer evenings, became iconic of American small-town life. The rockers squeaked and creaked, adding their rhythm to the soundscape of summer nights. Ice cream became a summer institution, a treat associated with hot weather and the desperate quest for anything cold. Ice cream socials, community gatherings where homemade ice cream was churned and served, provided both cooling relief and social occasion. The ice cream churn, requiring continuous cranking as the mixture froze, often became a communal activity, with neighbors taking turns at the crank while waiting for the reward. Here's a quirky detail. Ice cream's popularity was so linked to summer that many ice cream parlors simply closed for the winter months. The treat was seasonal, associated with heat and relief from heat, in ways that year-round availability would later obscure. Lemonade stands, operated by entrepreneurial children, became fixtures of summer neighborhoods. The combination of sweet, sour, and hopefully cold provided refreshment that seemed designed specifically for hot weather. The lemonade stand also served as early business education, teaching children about commerce while providing a service their neighbors actually wanted. Summer foods evolved around the reality of heat. Cooking became even more onerous in summer, when firing up the stove added unbearable heat to already hot kitchens. Families ate more cold foods, sliced meats, cheese, bread, fruits and vegetables that didn't require cooking. The summer salad, the cold supper, the picnic meal, all these developed partly from the need to minimize kitchen heat. Watermelon became synonymous with American summer, its cooling juiciness providing relief that almost no other food could match. Eating watermelon was a sensory experience of coolness, the wet fruit seeming to lower body temperature while satisfying thirst and hunger simultaneously. Watermelon patches and watermelon festivals became summer institutions, celebrating a fruit that embodied summer's challenges and pleasures. Sleep patterns adapted to summer reality. The siesta, or afternoon rest, was more common in hot regions, acknowledging that midday heat made productive activity nearly impossible. Evening activities extended later, taking advantage of cooler nighttime temperatures. The boundaries between day and night blurred during the hottest weeks, with people sleeping in snatches whenever they could, rather than in a single consolidated block. Summer romance flourished in the context of heat. The relaxed dress standards of hot weather, the evening gatherings on porches and in parks, the extended opportunities for unsupervised socializing, all these created conditions favourable to courtship. Summer resort romances became a recognised social phenomenon, with young people meeting under circumstances that urban life would never provide. The vocabulary of summer comfort entered American English. Dog days referred to the hottest period, traditionally late July through August, associated with the rising of the star Sirius, the dog star. Muggy described the combination of heat and humidity that made air feel thick and unbreathable. Regional expressions varied. Southerners and Northerners described the same experiences in different terms, but everyone understood what summer suffering meant. Children's summers were shaped by heat in lasting ways. School schedules, with their long summer breaks, developed partly from the agricultural calendar, but also from the recognition that learning was nearly impossible in unventilated schoolrooms during July and August. Summer became a season of freedom for children, of outdoor play and adventures, of memories that adults would carry for decades. The cultural legacy of 19th century summer suffering persists even now, when air conditioning has made most of that suffering unnecessary. We still eat ice cream in summer, still associate lemonade with hot days, still give children long breaks from school. These traditions originated in practical adaptations to thermal misery. They continue from cultural momentum long after the original necessity has disappeared. The church bell tolls 4 times, and through your window you notice the first faint suggestion that the sky might eventually lighten. Dawn approaches, slowly, reluctantly, bringing with it a new day that will be as hot as this night has been miserable. But dawn also brings, paradoxically, a kind of relief, the end of the night's failed attempts at sleep, the beginning of activity that at least distracts from discomfort. Let's look forward now to a future you can barely imagine, where the suffering you're enduring tonight becomes a historical curiosity rather than a lived experience. The promise of air conditioning shimmers on the horizon, though you have no name for it yet, no concept of what it will mean. The early 20th century will bring Willis Carrier's invention, not a sudden breakthrough, but an accumulation of insights that make practical cooling possible. First in factories and theatres, then in offices and department stores, then finally in homes, mechanical cooling will spread across America. The technology will transform everything, where people live, how they work, what they expect from indoor environments. The Sun Belt will become habitable in ways it never was before. Cities like Phoenix, Houston, Las Vegas, places where summer heat was historically brutal and populations accordingly limited, will explode with growth once air conditioning makes living there tolerable. The geography of American population will shift, following the cold air pumped by millions of compressors and condensers. Sleep will become reliable again. The restless nights you're experiencing now will become stories for grandchildren, tales of a primitive past when people actually suffered through summer heat, rather than simply adjusting a thermostat. The very concept of heat suffering will become abstract, historical, difficult to truly comprehend for generations raised in climate-controlled comfort. But something will be lost too. The porch culture, the community intimacy of shared outdoor evenings, the cultural adaptations to collective suffering, these will fade as people retreat to air-conditioned interiors. Neighbourhoods will grow quieter, more atomized, each family sealed in its cool cocoon, disconnected from the neighbours enduring their own private comfort. Historians of the future will look back on nights like this one with a mixture of horror and fascination. How did people survive? How did they work, raise children, build cities, create culture, all while enduring conditions that would be considered torture by later standards? The answer, which you know instinctively but which history books will struggle to convey, is simply, you adapt. You endure. You find small pleasures and minor reliefs and communal solidarity and shared suffering. You live. The sky is definitely lighter now. The deep black of midnight has given way to a dark blue that hints at approaching day. Birds are beginning to stir, their first tentative songs breaking the silence that had settled over the neighbourhood. The heat hasn't broken. It won't break until weather patterns shift and cooler air arrives. But the night is ending, and endings carry their own relief. Your wife stirs beside you, surfacing from whatever light sleep she managed to achieve. "Morning?" she asks, her voice foggy with exhaustion. "Almost," you say. "Another hour or so." She sighs, a sound that contains everything you've both experienced during these long hours. The frustration, the discomfort, the resignation. But there's something else in that sigh too. A recognition that you've survived another night, that dawn is coming, that life continues despite everything. You think about the day ahead. Work in a hot office, doing tasks that require concentration, you're not sure you can muster after a sleepless night. The children need feeding, need supervision, need care. Your wife faces her own exhausting day, her own domestic labours that don't pause for heat or sleeplessness. The burdens wait, indifferent to how ready you feel to carry them. But for now, in this quiet moment before the day truly begins, you can simply lie here and watch the light grow. The worst of the night is over. The suffocating darkness that pressed against you for hours is lifting, slowly giving way to something that feels almost like hope. You close your eyes, not expecting sleep but allowing yourself a moment of rest. The air is still warm, still heavy, still pressing against you with its unwelcome intimacy. But the birds are singing now, a chorus of small voices greeting the approaching sun. The city is beginning to stir. You hear the first wagons on cobblestones, the first voices calling in the distance, and somewhere, in a future you can't see, someone will read about nights like this and wonder what it was like. They'll sit in air-conditioned comfort, temperature precisely controlled, and try to imagine the suffocating summer nights of 1800s America. They'll understand intellectually, but not viscerally, the way you can understand a historical famine without knowing true hunger. But tonight, you know, you felt every breath of thick air, every drop of sweat, every minute of sleepless misery. You've experienced what millions of Americans experienced across a century of hot summers, that shared suffering that bound generations together in collective endurance. The light grows brighter. The sky shifts from blue to pink to gold. The night finally releases its grip. And somewhere in the exhaustion and relief, in the warming light of a summer dawn, your eyes grow heavy. Sleep, that elusive companion you've chased all night, settles over you at last. Your breathing deepens, your muscles release. For a few precious minutes before the day demands your attention, you drift. The heat remains, the summer goes on, but for now, in this gentle threshold between night and day, you find the rest you've been seeking. Let your own eyes close now. Let the tension drain from your shoulders. Let the rhythm of these words carry you toward your own rest, in whatever comfortable place you're hearing them. The suffocating summer nights of 1800s. America are long past. The air around you is cool, or at least cooler than what those sleepers endured. You have advantages they couldn't imagine, comforts they would have considered miraculous. So breathe deeply, settle into your pillows, let the history fade and the present embrace you. The dawn is coming for you too whenever you're ready for it. But for now, there's no rush, no obligation. Just rest, well-earned and long overdue. Sleep well, the night is over. You might know a Civil War veteran, or know of one. The war ended only recently in your timeline, or perhaps you're living through its aftermath. The men who returned from southern campaigns carry heat memories in their bodies as well as their minds. Some developed chronic conditions attributed to their summer exposure. Others simply remember, in the way that soldiers remember, what it felt like to march through hell in a wool coat. But there's hope on the horizon, not for tonight, not for this summer, but for future generations who will eventually escape the tyranny of summer heat. Let's look at the innovations beginning to emerge in the late 19th century, the technologies and ideas that will eventually transform human relationship with temperature. The electric fan represents the first practical step toward mechanized cooling. Before electricity, fans required human or water power, someone pulling a cord or a water wheel driving a belt system. These methods worked but were expensive and limited in application. With electricity, a small motor can spin fan blades indefinitely, creating constant airflow without constant human effort. Electric fans begin appearing in the 1880s and 1890s, first in commercial applications where the expense can be justified, then gradually in wealthier homes. The experience of sitting in front of an electric fan, feeling artificial breeze blow across sweaty skin, seems almost miraculous to those who first encounter it. The fan doesn't actually cool the air, it's still the same temperature, but moving air accelerates evaporation of sweat, creating the sensation of cooling that makes summer more bearable. The ceiling fan, electrically powered, transforms interior spaces. Mounted high, spinning continuously, it moves air throughout a room, preventing the stratification that makes ceiling-level temperatures much higher than floor-level temperatures. A room with a ceiling fan feels dramatically more comfortable than the same room without one, even though the thermometer would show identical readings. Here's a quirky detail about early electric fans. They were sometimes seen as health hazards. The same miasma theory that made people fear night air made some people fear artificial air movement, believing that the disturbed air might spread disease or cause illness. These fears were unfounded, but they slowed adoption of fan technology among the cautious. Beyond fans, more ambitious cooling technologies were beginning to develop. Mechanical refrigeration, which had existed in industrial form since the mid-century, was being refined and miniaturized. The basic principle, compress a gas, let it release heat, then allow it to expand and absorb heat from surroundings, was well understood. Applying that principle to cool living spaces rather than just preserve food was the next logical step. Ice-making machines had proven that artificial cold was possible. Instead of harvesting ice from frozen lakes and shipping it south, factories could manufacture ice year-round, anywhere there was power to run the compressors. This technology was transforming the ice industry, reducing dependence on weather and geography, making cold a manufactured commodity rather than a natural resource. The idea of using similar technology to cool buildings, rather than just make ice, was being explored by the 1890s. Early experiments showed promise. Theatres and public buildings could be made noticeably cooler through mechanical systems that circulated chilled air, but the cost was enormous, the technology unreliable, and the scale limited to special applications. Willis Carrier, who would eventually invent practical air conditioning in 1902, was still a young man in your timeline, perhaps not even born yet, depending on exactly when you're lying in your hot bedroom. His breakthrough, understanding that humidity control was as important as temperature control for human comfort, still lay ahead. But the pieces were coming together, the scientific and engineering knowledge accumulating that would make his invention possible. Improved building design also offered paths to summer relief. Architects began incorporating ventilation theory into their work, designing buildings with features that promoted natural airflow, high ceilings, transom windows, central hallways that channeled breezes. These passive cooling techniques couldn't match the dramatic effects of mechanical systems, but they could make buildings noticeably more comfortable without energy consumption. The public health movement contributed ideas about urban planning that would affect summer temperatures. Parks and green spaces, advocates argued, provided not just recreation, but cooling. Trees shaded the ground, grass absorbed less heat than pavement. Open spaces allowed air circulation that dense development prevented. The creation of Central Park and similar urban green spaces was motivated partly by desire to reduce the thermal intensity of cities. Water infrastructure improvements had similar effects. Drinking fountains provided access to water during hot days. Public bathhouses allowed people to cool their bodies through immersion. Fire hydrants, in some neighbourhoods, were opened during heat waves to create improvised cooling stations for children and adults alike. Historians still argue whether these late 19th century improvements constituted real progress towards summer comfort, or were merely modest mitigations of a fundamentally unchanged thermal reality. The answer is probably both. Conditions improved marginally while remaining brutal by modern standards. The arc of history bent toward comfort, but bent slowly. You know nothing of air conditioning lying in your hot bedroom. The concept would seem like science fiction, like a story from one of Mr. Verne's novels, a machine that makes cold air, that can cool an entire house, that allows summer to feel like autumn. Such things seem as impossible as flying to the moon, but they're coming. Not tonight, not this decade, perhaps not this century. But someday, your descendants will sleep through July nights in perfect comfort, and they will barely imagine what you're enduring right now. The 1890s would bring some of the deadliest heat waves in American history, events that finally forced cities and governments to confront summer heat as a public health emergency rather than a natural inevitability. Let's examine these catastrophic events and their lasting impact. The heatwave of 1896 stands out as particularly devastating. In August of that year, temperatures across the eastern United States soared to levels that overwhelmed all coping mechanisms. New York City was hit especially hard, experiencing nearly 2 weeks of temperatures exceeding 90 degrees, with humidity that made the air feel even hotter. The death toll was staggering. In New York alone, more than 1,000 people died directly from heat-related causes, with additional thousands dying from complications exacerbated by heat stress. These numbers didn't include deaths that went unreported or were attributed to other causes. The actual mortality was certainly higher, perhaps much higher, than official statistics suggested. Bodies overwhelmed the city's morgue facilities. The dead were stored in any available cold space, ice company warehouses, beer brewery cellars, while authorities struggled to process them. Funerals backed up for days. Families waited to bury their dead while bureaucracy and heat competed to complete decomposition. The victims were disproportionately poor, disproportionately immigrant, disproportionately residents of the tenement districts where housing was worst and escape was impossible. But the heat also killed middle-class and even wealthy New Yorkers, demonstrating that while money provided protection, it couldn't guarantee survival. Here's a detail that captures the desperation of that week. Police officers were ordered to spray down crowds with fire hoses, using water pressure to create cooling spray that people gathered under. Ice was distributed at police stations. Municipal piers were opened for public sleeping, allowing people to lie on wooden platforms over the cooling water of the harbour. These emergency measures saved lives, but they also revealed how unprepared the city was for predictable annual emergencies. The 1896 heatwave prompted investigative journalism that examined the structural causes of heat mortality. Reporters documented the conditions in tenement buildings, the lack of ventilation, the impossible choices facing families with nowhere to go. They connected housing policy to death tolls, arguing that building codes and landlord practices were killing people as surely as the weather. Police Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt, yes, that Theodore Roosevelt, future president, personally toured the tenement districts during the 1896 heatwave and was appalled by what he saw. His experience contributed to his later advocacy for housing reform and public health improvements, demonstrating how heatwave crises could shape political consciousness. The political response to 1896 was substantial if incomplete. New York and other cities began developing heat emergency protocols, free ice distribution, cooling stations, shortened working hours during heat emergencies. Building codes were strengthened to require better ventilation in new construction. The idea that government had responsibility for protecting citizens from heat became more widely accepted. Similar heat waves struck in later years, 1901, 1911, each one adding pressure for reform while claiming its own toll of victims. The 1911 heat wave killed over 1,000 people in New York alone, demonstrating that progress was painfully slow. The lessons of 1896 had not been fully learned. The same conditions that produced mass death in that year still existed 15 years later. Historians still argue whether the heat waves of the 1890s represented a turning point in American public health, or simply another episode in an ongoing struggle. The reforms they prompted were real, but limited. Summer continued to kill people by the hundreds throughout the early 20th century, until air conditioning finally provided the technological solution that policy measures couldn't achieve. The legacy of these heat waves extends beyond immediate policy changes. They established precedents for government response to weather emergencies, precedents that would later be applied to blizzards, hurricanes, and other disasters. They contributed to the growing expectation that cities should protect their residents from predictable dangers. They made heat mortality visible in ways that demanded response. You may or may not live to see the great heat waves of the 1890s, depending on your age and circumstances. If you do, you'll recognize them as extreme versions of the suffering you're experiencing tonight. The same misery, amplified to deadly intensity, claiming victims by the thousand. But tonight is tonight, and the 1890s are the future, and all you know is that the heat goes on. Summer nights in 19th century America weren't just survived, they were also, in their way, lived. The shared experience of heat suffering created cultural adaptations that shaped American life in ways that persist long after air conditioning made them unnecessary. Let's examine what summer nights meant for American culture, the traditions and customs born from collective heat endurance. The front porch emerged as America's summer living room, a transitional space between the unbearable interior and the slightly less unbearable exterior. Families gathered on porches in the evening, escaping hot indoor spaces, seeking whatever breeze might stir the humid air. The porch became a site of socializing, of watching the world pass by, of conversations with neighbors doing the same thing on their own porches. Porch culture fostered a kind of community intimacy that later generations, retreating to air-conditioned interiors, would largely abandon. You knew your neighbors because you saw them every evening sitting on their porches available for conversation. You watched children grow up, observed courtships developing, tracked the rhythms of family life across the street and down the block. The porch was a stage for domestic life, and everyone in the neighborhood was simultaneously performer and audience. Rocking chairs became symbols of summer leisure, their gentle motion creating a slight breeze for the seated person while requiring minimal exertion. The image of elderly people rocking on porches, slowly moving through hot summer evenings, became iconic of American small-town life. The rockers squeaked and creaked, adding their rhythm to the soundscape of summer nights. Ice cream became a summer institution, a treat associated with hot weather and the desperate quest for anything cold. Ice cream socials, community gatherings where homemade ice cream was churned and served, provided both cooling relief and social occasion. The ice cream churn, requiring continuous cranking as the mixture froze, often became a communal activity, with neighbours taking turns at the crank while waiting for the reward. Here's a quirky detail. Ice cream's popularity was so linked to summer that many ice cream parlours simply closed for the winter months. The treat was seasonal, associated with heat and relief from heat, in ways that year-round availability would later obscure. Lemonade stands, operated by entrepreneurial children, became fixtures of summer neighbourhoods. The combination of sweet, sour and hopefully cold provided refreshment that seemed designed specifically for hot weather. The lemonade stand also served as early business education, teaching children about commerce while providing a service their neighbours actually wanted. Summer foods evolved around the reality of heat. Cooking became even more onerous in summer, when firing up the stove added unbearable heat to already hot kitchens. Families ate more cold foods, sliced meats, cheese, bread, fruits and vegetables that didn't require cooking. The summer salad, the cold supper, the picnic meal, all these developed partly from the need to minimize kitchen heat. Watermelon became synonymous with American summer, its cooling juiciness providing relief that almost no other food could match. Eating watermelon was a sensory experience of coolness, the wet fruit seeming to lower body temperature while satisfying thirst and hunger simultaneously. Watermelon patches and watermelon festivals became summer institutions, celebrating a fruit that embodied summer's challenges and pleasures. Sleep patterns adapted to summer reality. The siesta or afternoon rest was more common in hot regions, acknowledging that midday heat made productive activity nearly impossible. Evening activities extended later, taking advantage of cooler nighttime temperatures. The boundaries between day and night blurred during the hottest weeks, with people sleeping in snatches whenever they could rather than in a single consolidated block. Summer romance flourished in the context of heat. The relaxed dress standards of hot weather, the evening gatherings on porches and in parks, the extended opportunities for unsupervised socializing, all these created conditions favourable to courtship. Summer resort romances became a recognised social phenomenon, with young people meeting under circumstances that urban life would never provide. The vocabulary of summer comfort entered American English. Dog days referred to the hottest period, traditionally late July through August, associated with the rising of the star Sirius, the dog star. Muggy described the combination of heat and humidity that made air feel thick and unbreathable. Regional expressions varied. Southerners and Northerners described the same experiences in different terms, But everyone understood what summer suffering meant. Children's summers were shaped by heat in lasting ways. School schedules, with their long summer breaks, developed partly from the agricultural calendar, but also from the recognition that learning was nearly impossible in unventilated schoolrooms during July and August. Summer became a season of freedom for children, of outdoor play and adventures, of memories that adults would carry for decades. The cultural legacy of 19th century summer suffering persists even now, when air conditioning has made most of that suffering unnecessary. We still eat ice cream in summer, still associate lemonade with hot days, still give children long breaks from school. These traditions originated in practical adaptations to thermal misery. They continue from cultural momentum long after the original necessity has disappeared. The church bell tolls 4 times, and through your window, you notice the first faint suggestion that the sky might eventually lighten. Dawn approaches slowly, reluctantly, bringing with it a new day that will be as hot as this night has been miserable. But dawn also brings, paradoxically, a kind of relief, the end of the night's failed attempts at sleep, the beginning of activity that at least distracts from discomfort. Let's look forward now to a future you can barely imagine, where the suffering you're enduring tonight becomes a historical curiosity rather than a lived experience. The promise of air conditioning shimmers on the horizon, though you have no name for it yet, no concept of what it will mean. The early 20th century will bring Willis Carrier's invention, not a sudden breakthrough but an accumulation of insights that make practical cooling possible. First in factories and theatres, then in offices and department stores, then finally in homes, mechanical cooling will spread across America. The technology will transform everything, where people live, how they work, what they expect from indoor environments. The Sunbelt will become habitable in ways it never was before. Cities like Phoenix, Houston, Las Vegas, places where summer heat was historically brutal and populations accordingly limited, will explode with growth once air conditioning makes living there tolerable. The geography of American population will shift, following the cold air pumped by millions of compressors and condensers. Sleep will become reliable again. The restless nights you're experiencing now will become stories for grandchildren, tales of a primitive past when people actually suffered through summer heat, rather than simply adjusting a thermostat. The very concept of heat suffering will become abstract, historical, difficult to truly comprehend for generations raised in climate-controlled comfort. But something will be lost too. The porch culture, the community intimacy of shared outdoor evenings, the cultural adaptations to collective suffering, these will fade as people retreat to air-conditioned interiors. Neighbourhoods will grow quieter, more atomized, each family sealed in its cool cocoon, disconnected from the neighbours enduring their own private comfort. Historians of the future will look back on nights like this one with a mixture of horror and fascination. How did people survive? How did they work, raise children, build cities, create culture, all while enduring conditions that would be considered torture by later standards? The answer, which you know instinctively but which history books will struggle to convey, is simply, you adapt, you endure. You find small pleasures and minor reliefs and communal solidarity and shared suffering. You live. The sky is definitely lighter now. The deep black of midnight has given way to a dark blue that hints at approaching day. Birds are beginning to stir, their first tentative songs breaking the silence that had settled over the neighbourhood. The heat hasn't broken. It won't break until weather patterns shift and cooler air arrives. But the night is ending, and endings carry their own relief. Your wife stirs beside you, surfacing from whatever light sleep she managed to achieve. "Morning?" she asks, her voice foggy with exhaustion. "Almost," you say. "Another hour or so?" She sighs, a sound that contains everything you've both experienced during these long hours, the frustration, the discomfort, the resignation. But there's something else in that sigh too, a recognition that you've survived another night, that dawn is coming, that life continues despite everything. You think about the day ahead, work, in a hot office, doing tasks that require concentration you're not sure you can muster after a sleepless night. The children need feeding, need supervision, need care. Your wife faces her own exhausting day, her own domestic labours that don't pause for heat or sleeplessness. The burdens wait, indifferent to how ready you feel to carry them. But for now, in this quiet moment before the day truly begins, you can simply lie here and watch the light grow. The worst of the night is over. The suffocating darkness that pressed against you for hours is lifting slowly, giving way to something that feels almost like hope. You close your eyes, not expecting sleep, but allowing yourself a moment of rest. The air is still warm, still heavy, still pressing against you with its unwelcome intimacy. But the birds are singing now, a chorus of small voices greeting the approaching sun. The city is beginning to stir. You hear the first wagons on cobblestones, the first voices calling in the distance, and somewhere, in a future you can't see, someone will read about nights like this and wonder what it was like. They'll sit in air-conditioned comfort, temperature precisely controlled, and try to imagine the suffocating summer nights of 1800s America. They'll understand intellectually, but not viscerally, the way you can understand a historical famine without knowing true hunger. But tonight, you know, you've felt every breath of thick air, every drop of sweat, every minute of sleepless misery. You've experienced what millions of Americans experienced across a century of hot summers, that shared suffering that bound generations together in collective endurance. The light grows brighter, the sky shifts from blue to pink to gold. The night finally releases its grip. And somewhere in the exhaustion and relief, in the warming light of a summer dawn, your eyes grow heavy. Sleep, that elusive companion you've chased all night, settles over you at last. Your breathing deepens, your muscles release. For a few precious minutes before the day demands your attention, you drift. The heat remains, the summer goes on. But for now, in this gentle threshold between night and day, you find the rest you've been seeking. Let your own eyes close now. Let the tension drain from your shoulders. Let the rhythm of these words carry you toward your own rest, in whatever comfortable place you're hearing them. The suffocating summer nights of 1800s, America are long past. The air around you is cool, or at least cooler than what those sleepers endured. You have advantages they couldn't imagine, comforts they would have considered miraculous. So breathe deeply, settle into your pillows, let the history fade and the present embrace you. The dawn is coming for you too, whenever you're ready for it. But for now there's no rush, no obligation, just rest, well-earned and long overdue. Sleep well, the night is over. The memories of Civil War veterans, recorded in the decades after the conflict, frequently mention the heat alongside the horror of combat. These men, who faced death daily and witnessed atrocities that would haunt them forever, still remembered the suffocating southern summers as among the worst things they endured. Heat suffering became part of the war's legacy, alongside the battles and casualties. You might know a Civil War veteran, or know of one. The war ended only recently in your timeline, or perhaps you're living through its aftermath. The men who returned from southern campaigns carry heat memories in their bodies as well as their minds. Some developed chronic conditions attributed to their summer exposure. Others simply remember, in the way that soldiers remember, what it felt like to march through hell in a wool coat. But there's hope on the horizon, not for tonight, not for this summer, but for future generations who will eventually escape the tyranny of summer heat. Let's look at the innovations beginning to emerge in the late 19th century, the technologies and ideas that will eventually transform human relationship with temperature. The electric fan represents the first practical step toward mechanized cooling. Before electricity, fans required human or water power, someone pulling a cord, or a water wheel driving a belt system. These methods worked but were expensive and limited in application. With electricity, a small motor can spin fan blades indefinitely, creating constant airflow without constant human effort. Electric fans begin appearing in the 1880s and 1890s, first in commercial applications where the expense can be justified, then gradually in wealthier homes. The experience of sitting in front of an electric fan, feeling artificial breeze blow across sweaty skin, seems almost miraculous to those who first encounter it. The fan doesn't actually cool the air, it's still the same temperature, but moving air accelerates evaporation of sweat, creating the sensation of cooling that makes summer more bearable. The ceiling fan, electrically powered, transforms interior spaces. Mounted high, spinning continuously, it moves air throughout a room, preventing the stratification that makes ceiling-level temperatures much higher than floor-level temperatures. A room with a ceiling fan feels dramatically more comfortable than the same room without one, even though the thermometer would show identical readings. Here's a quirky detail about early electric fans. They were sometimes seen as health hazards. The same miasma theory that made people fear night air made some people fear artificial air movement, believing that the disturbed air might spread disease or cause illness. These fears were unfounded, but they slowed adoption of fan technology among the cautious. Beyond fans, more ambitious cooling technologies were beginning to develop. Mechanical refrigeration, which had existed in industrial form since the mid-century, was being refined and miniaturized. The basic principle, compressor gas, let it release heat, then allow it to expand and absorb heat from surroundings, was well understood. Applying that principle to cool living spaces rather than just preserve food was the next logical step. Ice-making machines had proven that artificial cold was possible. Instead of harvesting ice from frozen lakes and shipping it south, factories could manufacture ice year-round, anywhere there was power to run the compressors. This technology was transforming the ice industry, reducing dependence on weather and geography, making cold a manufactured commodity rather than a natural resource. The idea of using similar technology to cool buildings rather than just make ice was being explored by the 1890s. Early experiments showed promise. Theatres and public buildings could be made noticeably cooler through mechanical systems that circulated chilled air. But the cost was enormous, the technology unreliable, and the scale limited to special applications. Willis Carrier, who would eventually invent practical air conditioning in 1902, was still a young man in your timeline, perhaps not even born yet, depending on exactly when you're lying in your hot bedroom. His breakthrough, understanding that humidity control was as important as temperature control for human comfort, still lay ahead. But the pieces were coming together, the scientific and engineering knowledge accumulating that would make his invention possible. Improved building design also offered paths to summer relief. Architects began incorporating ventilation theory into their work, designing buildings with features that promoted natural airflow, high ceilings, transom windows, central hallways that channeled breezes. These passive cooling techniques couldn't match the dramatic effects of mechanical systems, but they could make buildings noticeably more comfortable without energy consumption. The public health movement contributed ideas about urban planning that would affect summer temperatures. Parks and green spaces, advocates argued, provided not just recreation but cooling. Trees shaded the ground, grass absorbed less heat than pavement. Open spaces allowed air circulation that dense development prevented. The creation of Central Park and similar urban green spaces was motivated partly by desire to reduce the thermal intensity of cities. Water infrastructure improvements had similar effects. Drinking fountains provided access to water during hot days. Public bathhouses allowed people to cool their bodies through immersion. Fire hydrants in some neighbourhoods were opened during heat waves to create improvised cooling stations for children and adults alike. Historians still argue whether these late 19th century improvements constituted real progress towards summer comfort, or were merely modest mitigations of a fundamentally unchanged thermal reality. The answer is probably both. Conditions improved marginally while remaining brutal by modern standards. The arc of history bent toward comfort, but bent slowly. You know nothing of air conditioning lying in your hot bedroom? The concept would seem like science fiction, like a story from one of Mr. Verne's novels. A machine that makes cold air, that can cool an entire house, that allows summer to feel like autumn. Such things seem as impossible as flying to the moon, but they're coming. Not tonight, not this decade, perhaps not this century, but someday your descendants will sleep through July nights in perfect comfort, and they will barely imagine what you're enduring right now. The 1890s would bring some of the deadliest heat waves in American history, events that finally forced cities and governments to confront summer heat as a public health emergency rather than a natural inevitability. Let's examine these catastrophic events and their lasting impact. The heat wave of 1896 stands out as particularly devastating. In August of that year, temperatures across the eastern United States soared to levels that overwhelmed all coping mechanisms. New York City was hit especially hard, experiencing nearly 2 weeks of temperatures exceeding 90 degrees, with humidity that made the air feel even hotter. The death toll was staggering. In New York alone, more than 1,000 people died directly from heat-related causes, with additional thousands dying from complications exacerbated by heat stress. These numbers didn't include deaths that went unreported or were attributed to other causes. The actual mortality was certainly higher, perhaps much higher, than official statistics suggested. Bodies overwhelmed the city's morgue facilities. The dead were stored in any available cold space, ice company warehouses, beer brewery cellars, while authorities struggled to process them. Funerals backed up for days. Families waited to bury their dead while bureaucracy and heat competed to complete decomposition. The victims were disproportionately poor, disproportionately immigrant, disproportionately residents of the tenement districts where housing was worst, and escape was impossible. But the heat also killed middle-class and even wealthy New Yorkers, demonstrating that while money provided protection, it couldn't guarantee survival. Here's a detail that captures the desperation of that week. Police officers were ordered to spray down crowds with fire hoses, using water pressure to create cooling spray that people gathered under. Ice was distributed at police stations. Municipal piers were opened for public sleeping, allowing people to lie on wooden platforms over the cooling water of the harbour. These emergency measures saved lives, but they also revealed how unprepared the city was for predictable annual emergencies. The 1896 heatwave prompted investigative journalism that examined the structural causes of heat mortality. Reporters documented the conditions in tenement buildings, the lack of ventilation, the impossible choices facing families with nowhere to go. They connected housing policy to death tolls, arguing that building codes and landlord practices were killing people as surely as the weather. Police Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt, yes, that Theodore Roosevelt, future president, personally toured the tenement districts during the 1896 heatwave and was appalled by what he saw. His experience contributed to his later advocacy for housing reform and public health improvements, demonstrating how heatwave crises could shape political consciousness. The political response to 1896 was substantial if incomplete. New York and other cities began developing heat emergency protocols, free ice distribution, cooling stations, shortened working hours during heat emergencies. Building codes were strengthened to require better ventilation in new construction. The idea that government had responsibility for protecting citizens from heat became more widely accepted. Similar heat waves struck in later years, 1901, 1911, each one adding pressure for reform while claiming its own toll of victims. The 1911 heat wave killed over 1,000 people in New York alone, demonstrating that progress was painfully slow. The lessons of 1896 had not been fully learned. The same conditions that produced mass death in that year still existed 15 years later. Historians still argue whether the heat waves of the 1890s represented a turning point in American public health, or simply another episode in an ongoing struggle. The reforms they prompted were real but limited. Summer continued to kill people by the hundreds throughout the early 20th century, until air conditioning finally provided the technological solution that policy measures couldn't achieve. The legacy of these heat waves extends beyond immediate policy changes. They established precedents for government response to weather emergencies, precedents that would later be applied to blizzards, hurricanes, and other disasters. They contributed to the growing expectation that cities should protect their residents from predictable dangers. They made heat mortality visible in ways that demanded response. You may or may not live to see the great heat waves of the 1890s, depending on your age and circumstances. If you do, you'll recognize them as extreme versions of the suffering you're experiencing tonight, the same misery, amplified to deadly intensity, claiming victims by the thousand. But tonight is tonight, and the 1890s are the future, and all you know is that the heat goes on. Summer nights in 19th century America weren't just survived, they were also in their way lived. The shared experience of heat suffering created cultural adaptations that shaped American life in ways that persist long after air conditioning made them unnecessary. Let's examine what summer nights meant for American culture, the traditions and customs born from collective heat endurance. The front porch emerged as America's summer living room, a transitional space between the unbearable interior and the slightly less unbearable exterior. Families gathered on porches in the evening, escaping hot indoor spaces, seeking whatever breeze might stir the humid air. The porch became a site of socializing, of watching the world pass by, of conversations with neighbors doing the same thing on their own porches. Porch culture fostered a kind of community intimacy that later generations, retreating to air-conditioned interiors, would largely abandon. You knew your neighbors because you saw them every evening, sitting on their porches, available for conversation. You watched children grow up, observed courtships developing, tracked the rhythms of family life across the street and down the block. The porch was a stage for domestic life, and everyone in the neighborhood was simultaneously performer and audience. Rocking chairs became symbols of summer leisure, their gentle motion creating a slight breeze for the seated person, while requiring minimal exertion. The image of elderly people rocking on porches, slowly moving through hot summer evenings, became iconic of American small-town life. The rockers squeaked and creaked, adding their rhythm to the soundscape of summer nights. Ice cream became a summer institution, a treat associated with hot weather and the desperate quest for anything cold. Ice cream socials, community gatherings where homemade ice cream was churned and served, provided both cooling relief and social occasion. The ice cream churn, requiring continuous cranking as the mixture froze, often became a communal activity, with neighbours taking turns at the crank while waiting for the reward. Here's a quirky detail. Ice cream's popularity was so linked to summer that many ice cream parlours simply closed for the winter months. The treat was seasonal, associated with heat and relief from heat, in ways that year-round availability would later obscure. Lemonade stands, operated by entrepreneurial children, became fixtures of summer neighbourhoods. The combination of sweet, sour and hopefully cold provided refreshment that seemed designed specifically for hot weather. The lemonade stand also served as early business education, teaching children about commerce while providing a service their neighbours actually wanted. Summer foods evolved around the reality of heat. Cooking became even more onerous in summer, when firing up the stove added unbearable heat to already hot kitchens. Families ate more cold foods, sliced meats, cheese, bread, fruits and vegetables that didn't require cooking. The summer salad, the cold supper, the picnic meal, all these developed partly from the need to minimise kitchen heat. Watermelon became synonymous with American summer, its cooling juiciness providing relief that almost no other food could match. Eating watermelon was a sensory experience of coolness, the wet fruit seeming to lower body temperature while satisfying thirst and hunger simultaneously. Watermelon patches and watermelon festivals became summer institutions, celebrating a fruit that embodied summer's challenges and pleasures. Sleep patterns adapted to summer reality. The siesta, or afternoon rest, was more common in hot regions, acknowledging that midday heat made productive activity nearly impossible. Evening activities extended later, taking advantage of cooler nighttime temperatures. The boundaries between day and night blurred during the hottest weeks, with people sleeping in snatches whenever they could, rather than in a single consolidated block. Summer romance flourished in the context of heat. The relaxed dress standards of hot weather, the evening gatherings on porches and in parks, the extended opportunities for unsupervised socializing, all these created conditions favourable to courtship. Summer resort romances became a recognised social phenomenon, with young people meeting under circumstances that urban life would never provide. The vocabulary of summer comfort entered American English. Dog days referred to the hottest period, traditionally late July through August, associated with the rising of the star Sirius, the dog star. Muggy described the combination of heat and humidity that made air feel thick and unbreathable. Regional expressions varied. Southerners and Northerners described the same experiences in different terms, but everyone understood what summer suffering meant. Children's summers were shaped by heat in lasting ways. School schedules, with their long summer breaks, developed partly from the agricultural calendar, but also from the recognition that learning was nearly impossible in unventilated schoolrooms during July and August. Summer became a season of freedom for children, of outdoor play and adventures, of memories that adults would carry for decades. The cultural legacy of 19th century summer suffering persists even now, when air conditioning has made most of that suffering unnecessary. We still eat ice cream in summer, still associate lemonade with hot days, still give children long breaks from school. These traditions originated in practical adaptations to thermal misery. They continue from cultural momentum long after the original necessity has disappeared. The church bell tolls 4 times, and through your window you notice the first faint suggestion that the sky might eventually lighten. Dawn approaches, slowly, reluctantly, bringing with it a new day that will be as hot as this night has been miserable. But dawn also brings paradoxically a kind of relief, the end of the night's failed attempts at sleep, the beginning of activity that at least distracts from discomfort. Let's look forward now to a future you can barely imagine, where the suffering you're enduring tonight becomes a historical curiosity rather than a lived experience. The promise of air conditioning shimmers on the horizon, though you have no name for it yet, no concept of what it will mean. The early 20th century will bring Willis Carrier's invention, Not a sudden breakthrough, but an accumulation of insights that make practical cooling possible. First in factories and theatres, then in offices and department stores, then finally in homes, mechanical cooling will spread across America. The technology will transform everything, where people live, how they work, what they expect from indoor environments. The Sun Belt will become habitable in ways it never was before. Cities like Phoenix, Houston, Las Vegas, places where summer heat was historically brutal and populations accordingly limited, will explode with growth once air conditioning makes living there tolerable. The geography of American population will shift, following the cold air pumped by millions of compressors and condensers. Sleep will become reliable again. The restless nights you're experiencing now will become stories for grandchildren, tales of a primitive past when people actually suffered through summer heat, rather than simply adjusting a thermostat. The very concept of heat suffering will become abstract, historical, difficult to truly comprehend for generations raised in climate-controlled comfort. But something will be lost too. The porch culture, the community intimacy of shared outdoor evenings, the cultural adaptations to collective suffering, these will fade as people retreat to air-conditioned interiors. Neighbourhoods will grow quieter, more atomized, each family sealed in its cool cocoon, disconnected from the neighbours enduring their own private comfort. Historians of the future will look back on nights like this one with a mixture of horror and fascination. How did people survive? How did they work, raise children, build cities, create culture, all while enduring conditions that would be considered torture by later standards? The answer, which you know instinctively but which history books will struggle to convey, is simply, you adapt. You endure. You find small pleasures and minor reliefs and communal solidarity and shared suffering. You live. The sky is definitely lighter now. The deep black of midnight has given way to a dark blue that hints at approaching day. Birds are beginning to stir, their first tentative songs breaking the silence that had settled over the neighbourhood. The heat hasn't broken. It won't break until weather patterns shift and cooler air arrives. But the night is ending, and endings carry their own relief. Your wife stirs beside you, surfacing from whatever light sleep she managed to achieve. "Morning?" she asks, her voice foggy with exhaustion. "Almost," you say. "Another hour or so." She sighs, a sound that contains everything you've both experienced during these long hours. The frustration, the discomfort, the resignation. But there's something else in that sigh too. A recognition that you've survived another night, that dawn is coming, that life continues despite everything. You think about the day ahead. Work in a hot office, doing tasks that require concentration, you're not sure you can muster after a sleepless night. The children need feeding, need supervision, need care. Your wife faces her own exhausting day, her own domestic labours that don't pause for heat or sleeplessness. The burdens wait, indifferent to how ready you feel to carry them. But for now, in this quiet moment before the day truly begins, you can simply lie here and watch the light grow. The worst of the night is over. The suffocating darkness that pressed against you for hours is lifting, slowly giving way to something that feels almost like hope. You close your eyes, not expecting sleep but allowing yourself a moment of rest. The air is still warm, still heavy, still pressing against you with its unwelcome intimacy. But the birds are singing now, a chorus of small voices greeting the approaching sun. The city is beginning to stir. You hear the first wagons on cobblestones, the first voices calling in the distance, and somewhere, in a future you can't see, someone will read about nights like this and wonder what it was like. They'll sit in air-conditioned comfort, temperature precisely controlled, and try to imagine the suffocating summer nights of 1800s America. They'll understand intellectually, but not viscerally, the way you can understand a historical famine without knowing true hunger. But tonight, you know, you felt every breath of thick air, every drop of sweat, every minute of sleepless misery. You've experienced what millions of Americans experienced across a century of hot summers, that shared suffering that bound generations together in collective endurance. The light grows brighter. The sky shifts from blue to pink to gold. The night finally releases its grip. And somewhere in the exhaustion and relief, in the warming light of a summer dawn, your eyes grow heavy. Sleep, that elusive companion you've chased all night, settles over you at last. Your breathing deepens, your muscles release. For a few precious minutes before the day demands your attention, you drift. The heat remains, the summer goes on, But for now, in this gentle threshold between night and day, you find the rest you've been seeking. Let your own eyes close now. Let the tension drain from your shoulders. Let the rhythm of these words carry you toward your own rest, in whatever comfortable place you're hearing them. The suffocating summer nights of 1800s. America are long past. The air around you is cool, or at least cooler than what those sleepers endured. You have advantages they couldn't imagine, comforts they would have considered miraculous. So breathe deeply, settle into your pillows, let the history fade and the present embrace you. The dawn is coming for you too whenever you're ready for it. But for now, there's no rush, no obligation. Just rest, well-earned and long overdue. Sleep well, the night is over.